Hey, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Astrology podcast. In this episode, I'm going to be talking with astrologer Gary Lorentzen about the astrology of the AIDS epidemic. Hey, Gary, thanks for joining me today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Yeah, so this is a topic I wanted to approach from a couple of different angles here. And on the one side, sort of the broader parallels recently that many astrologers have noted between, for example, the Saturn-Pluto conjunction in 2020 and how that really coincided with the explosion of the COVID epidemic, the COVID-19 epidemic. And astrologers have noted the parallels with the emergence of the AIDS epidemic in the early 1980s under a similar Saturn-Pluto conjunction, which only occur about every 40 years, and sort of approach it from the perspective of mundane astrology in looking at that and some of the parallels. But then also there was a more sort of personal dimension to it in terms of the impact on the astrological community. And I know that's something that you've written about back in 2013 and 2014. You wrote the introduction or the foreword to the first published volume of papers from the first queer astrology conference. And you mentioned the huge impact of just the AIDS kind of decimating an entire generation of astrologers that were lost in the 80s and 90s. And then you wrote in 2014 an expanded article on that in the Ascendant Journal, which is the journal for the Association for Young Astrologers. What was the title of that article again?
I believe it was the reflections on a lost generation of gay astrologers. I think it was something like that. Reflections on
Reflections on a lost generation of queer astrologers.
That's it. Yeah.
So so I wanted to talk about that from both of those perspectives. And maybe first we can start with that more personal perspective, just about what's your background as an astrologer, or what's your history with the subject?
I was introduced to astrology in college by a professor in college in a program called The Impact of Buddhism on the West. And astrology was presented as a Buddhist practice as we were academically studying the stuff. And then I started studying it on my own then, but he had an adjunct course that lasted a quarter, and it was called Astrology and I Ching Studies. Both. He was taking two different things. I mean, I Ching is obviously Taoism, not Buddhism, but he was looking at those two things and showing their correspondences. And he was a friend of Dane Rudhyar's, which at the time I did not know that.
Oh, wow.
Because I didn't know who Dane Rudhyar was.
Mm-hmm. So what year is this?
1972.
Okay, so you sort of start learning astrology in 1972, and you were born in 1950?
Right.
Do you share your birth data?
August 18th, 1950, approximately 9:22, 9:23, somewhere in there, 9:23 p.m. We're not sure exactly.
Okay. Do you mind if I share the chart?
No, not at all.
Here's the chart really quickly for the audio listeners. So you have 29 degrees of Aries rising, mm-hmm. and your sun is in Leo at 25 degrees, and your moon is in Scorpio at 6 degrees.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Correct. All right. So 1972, your teacher knows Dane Rudhyar, which is kind of crazy. He's one of the leading astrologers of the 20th century, one of the most influential astrologers.
Well, it was Dr. Jose Arguelles. And I don't know if you know that name. He was the mandala man, right? He did the artwork of mandalas, and he also is the man behind the 1986 what did we call that again? The
harmonic convergence.
The harmonic convergence. He was the man behind that.
Well, and then that later got tied into like some of the 2012 like Mayan astrology stuff, I think, as
Correct.
well.
And he wrote a book on the interpretation of the Mayan astrology. So
got it.
The Mayan calendar.
So he was the one that got you into astrology?
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. Mm-hmm. So you're active then, or you start studying astrology then, and you actually become active in the astrological community itself, right?
Right. A friend of mine and I started working together as astrologers in Olympia, Washington. And we worked out of a bookstore called The Bookstore. And not very
Nice.
creative, I
That's a very
realize.
creative name. I like it. It's straight into the point.
Straight to the point. And uh, we practiced astrology out of there then for a couple of years. But then I moved to Seattle and became involved with the Washington State Association and became president of it. And I studied in Seattle. I studied with Mark Robertson and Joanne Wickenberg primarily, and then I sort of went off on my own, and I became the house astrologer at Beltane Books at 50th and University Way in 1970. Oh, when was that? 76, I think. And of course, then Maggie Nalbandian and Jeff Green were down the street, and David and Lucy Pond were at the other end of the street at the Magus, associated with the bookstore called the Magus. So we all knew each other quite well. And Jeff and I used to trade students. My students would go to his class, his would come to mine. I would go sit in his classes. Sometimes he'd come and sit in mine. And I became very good friends with the Nalbandians then. And of course, Laura was just a kid, but it was a pretty heady time in Seattle for astrology, and sort of cut my teeth on all of that. Then primarily I was doing humanistic astrology at the time. I wasn't doing mundane particularly, although I had read Rudyard's The Astrology of America's Destiny, in which he promotes that rectified version of the Sibley chart, right?
Okay. Yeah, and that's something you've eventually gone on to specialize in mundane astrology,
Right.
and that was part of actually why I wanted to talk to you about this episode of approaching this from a mundane perspective as well as from like a personal perspective, because you have both of those interests sort of converge in the same place.
Yeah, that's true.
And then the Nalbandians that you mentioned are the founders of the Northwest Astrology Conference, which is still going to this day, as well as Maggie Nalbandian was the founder of Kepler College.
Mm-hmm.
And
And
I
she
guess,
invited me. Yes, I was founding board member for Kepler College. She called me and said, Gary, we want to do this. Please come and help us do this. So
right.
I was involved primarily with the curriculum and instructional design development. So.
Yeah. So we did a whole episode. That was the last time you were on the podcast, actually, was back in 2017 in episode 75, where you and me and Laura Nalbandian talked about the life and work of astrologer Maggie Nalbandian and talked about the formation of Kepler College and how you were responsible in large part for designing the curriculum.
Mm-hmm. That's true. And also arguing the case in front of the higher ed board in Olympia to get it approved as a BA.
Okay.
That was my job too. So that's what I did.
Sure. So one of the things in your article that I was noting is that in the 1970s, we have the emergence of psychological astrology, that entire generation of astrologers who were born in like the 1940s, the baby boomer generation, are really coming of age, and psychological and humanistic astrology is really starting to take off. And one of the things you noted in the article also is that there's starting to be some movement towards developing more progressive or sort of like queer oriented astrologies, or ones that are at least open and not sort of regressive in terms of their treatment of different sexual orientations. But that was just getting started in the 1970s before the AIDS crisis hit.
Right. And truly there were, but it was still kind of under wraps. I mean, I can remember meeting with Tony Joseph. I don't even know if you know that name, but he was an up and coming astrologer in the 1970s and really brilliant at what he did. And I really, really liked his work. And I can remember he was in Seattle and stayed with me, and we went out to dinner. And I realized, okay, the way he put it was, are you also puer aeternis? Latin for eternal youth, right? And I looked at him kind of funny, and I thought, it's by that. And then it suddenly dawned on me, oh, I know what it's code. And I said, yes, I am. And he smiled. And so then we started talking about how awful the literature was
Mhm.
on, especially in terms of relationships, and how marginalizing so much of the astrological literature was in regards to gay people and the way it was presented in the literature. But then, the literature people in the 1970s, what we were reading and studying was all that stuff from the early part of the 1900s, and some of it even into the 1800s, right? We didn't
Right.
have a lot of literature. There wasn't a body of literature that went beyond that too much. A lot of theosophical stuff, right, was in the mix. And so he expressed his frustration at how do we overcome that? How do we re-educate people?
Right, because the delineation still tended to like pathologize homosexuality in different
Right,
ways.
exactly. Pathologized and marginalized, and he was saying, he was from New York, and he was saying, I have gay clients. I can't tell them these things that I'm learning. When I studied, but this is what it's saying about it. I can't tell that to a gay client because
Right,
I'm
because it'll tend to frame it like being a gay or lesbian in like a negative light, or
exactly
associate with negative aspects or something like that.
right. Exactly. And that's when I first started thinking about it myself, was like, how do we depathologize the astrology we're using when we're dealing with LGBTQ people? And of course, then in talking to other people going on into the early 80s, one of my good friends, Bruce Hammerslaw, also openly gay, we talked about it a lot as well. And there were other people too. I mean, but again, it was one of those things, you get together at a conference and you get together in your small little group and you share information and concerns, and it didn't go beyond that, other than I noticed that some people were starting to write about things. Howard Sesbordis, for example, he started writing some psychological stuff that started nudging the astrological community in a new direction when it came to humanistic astrology. Same with Mark Robertson. And then Mark Robertson died in 80, I want to say 85, 86. So he wasn't doing anything anymore. And what he initially put out was he put out a book, and I can't remember exactly what it was called, but it dealt with sexuality. And he took a completely different view of sexuality and relationships than any other astrologer I had ever read. And then I realized that he was trying to push things forward as well. So it was starting, but then we lost them all. I mean,
Right. You listed, I think, in your article, at least 14 astrologers that you
yeah,
knew of who
right.
had died of AIDS between the early 1980s and the mid 1990s at the height of
Right.
the AIDS epidemic.
That's right. Yeah.
So, and part of your point with that is that some of these were actually some of the leading astrologers in the community, but they were
Yeah.
also an entire generation of people that otherwise would have been at the forefront and having some of those discussions, and were starting to, in some instances, come out, even though that they there was still fear and there's still a lot of reluctance to come out at that time because it could have had negative social implications in the astrological community.
Yeah.
But that whole process basically got delayed a generation until eventually, in 2013, we had the first queer astrology
First queer astrology.
conference.
And I'm so grateful for the younger astrologers who saw the need and took that bull by the horns and started moving things forward. Because people in my generation, there weren't that many of us left, to be honest. I mean, yeah, there are still a few. Like Chris Renstrom and I get together and talk, and but it's completely different because we just have that big hole in our generation of gay astrologers. When you talk about you're missing at least 14 or 15 important astrologers who actually were contributing something, like Richard Eidemann and Tony Joseph and Bruce Hammerslaw. And I mean, it just goes on and on. That Howard Sass-Borders. And we just, it was just very frustrating. And it's wonderful that this younger generation has decided to tackle that. And as they say, turned it into a verb. We're going to queer astrology. And I'm just really grateful that there's a generation that is both intellectually open enough to do that, and also think of it as almost a moral imperative.
Right. Yeah, I interviewed one of the founders of the Queer Astrology Conference, Ian Waisler, in episode 83 of the Astrology podcast back in 2016. So people can listen to that for more background on just the formation of some of those first conferences, and that's still ongoing. But one of the things maybe that's hard to understand, what was it like, is that the astrological community wasn't necessarily welcoming for gay people in like the 1970s and 80s, right?
No, not at all. Not at all. But one of the things about my generation of baby boomer astrologers, when we came into astrology, the AFA was pretty much the only show in town. And they were arch conservative culturally. Just that organization was just really tied down. And in 1975, at the conference in San Francisco, the AFA conference, it came to a head where so many of the younger astrologers of my generation who were there sort of rebelled and simply walked away from that, and started all these new organizations and associations, everything from NCGR to, the whole gamut of things that came after that 1975 event in San Francisco. And I think part of it was also some of the gay astrologers there. What was being said about that, about homosexuality, was it was insulting. And so for me, and I know Tony Joseph was there as well, and a few others, we just rejected it. We just put our hands up and said, none of this stuff, forget it. We're not interested in these people, in this point of view, in doing this kind of astrology. I never went back to an AFA conference again.
Okay, so that was a huge generate, because they were the only ones organizing conferences up to that point, and it was the only national astrological organization in the US. But then all of a sudden, once you have that split in the 70s and 80s, there's other organizations being led by younger astrologers that are doing things, and things start shifting and heading in a new direction.
Right. That's exactly what happened. And I can remember it was in 1978 that in Seattle, we decided to have, well, actually it was before that, the year before in 77, we decided to have a sort of mini conference. And it was just local Northwest astrologers. And it went over so well that Maggie said, I want to do this and create a regional annual conference. And so the first effort to do that was done by the WSAA, the Washington State Astrological Association, and they held it at Ocean Shores. And Maggie helped organize that. And out of that experience then in 78, she goes, I want to go beyond the region. I want to have a conference here in Seattle that is national and international in scope eventually. And that was her objective. So then I believe it was 84 when the first NORWAC, as it took that much time for her to put things together and figure out how to do it and how to do it right. So that's NORWAC was one of those very first regional conferences like that had sort of a national import. I know there was one in Southwest, the Southwestern United States in Colorado, in California, and there was another one in the Northeast. There was another one in Southeast with the Metropolitan Atlanta group. when they organized one, then two. So during the 1980s, these different conferences started popping up regionally around the country, and sort of leaving the AFA behind in that sense.
Right. There's just this huge generational shift. And NCJR and ESAR were founded and everything else. And then in terms of even like the decade that led up to the 80s, it seems like the sort of gay rights movement was starting to gain steam at that point,
Yeah.
where you have like, Stonewall happened in what, 1969?
June
Right,
2869, yeah.
yeah, and this isn't a time chart, but I always like note that Uranus ingress, that Uranus had just gone into Libra in that chart as a really like interesting marker for that being a real turning point.
Yeah, Uranus at 0 Libra. It's hard to avoid what that meant. I mean, when I first saw that too, back when I was first starting to do astrology in the early 70s, that Uranus at 0 Libra, and I went, okay, there's something there to look at.
Right.
But the timing, if you want the timing is 1:20 a.m. is when the very first of the demonstrations or riots in response to the police started.
1:20 a.m. on June 28th.
Correct.
Got it. There it is. So for the audio listeners, that gives us a chart with 20 Aries rising on the ascendant, and Uranus is over in the 7th whole sign house. It's just set at the descendant, maybe like an hour earlier. It's at 3 degrees of Libra. So it's like just ingressed into Libra. And then what was this event, or what was the significance for those that don't have any background on it?
The Stonewall Inn was a gay bar in Greenwich Village, and it was allowed to stay open because the proprietors actually had to pay the police bribes not to raid the place. But actually, the way it worked was they would pay the police, who knows how much, I don't have any idea. But then the police would have to raid them. They would say, well, we have to raid, so we'll call you and tell you when we're coming. And then there were certain rules that had to be followed once the police were there. You couldn't be dancing, you couldn't be touching, all these weird little rules the police had around that. And they came that night unannounced, apparently, and people inside were not prepared for a police raid. And and especially the drag queens in there responded very negatively. And so as they were trying to haul people out and put them in the paddy wagon, those drag queens just rebelled. They just started taking their shoes off and throwing at the police, and then people standing around started throwing things, and bricks started being thrown. And then it lasted for 3 days. And then on July 4th, it followed, the Gay Liberation Front was founded in New York City, the GLF. And that's the first, shall we say, civil rights organization that pushed gay rights. And that was in the afternoon of July 4th. And I don't have a time chart for that, but I know it was in the early afternoon sometime.
July 4th of 1969.
Yeah.
Okay, there we go. Okay, so it looks like Mars retrograde. What else is going on in this chart? Uranus still there in early Libra, and Jupiter's coming in for a conjunction pretty soon. It's actually it's at 28 Virgo.
Yeah, it's going to cross over and conjoin with Uranus as well. Yeah,
literally within the next like few weeks you get that first conjunction in Libra. That's really striking.
Yeah.
So this is a decade before, and things are picking up steam, and then all of a sudden it's like you get to the early 1980s and 1981, and this marks the emergence of the AIDS epidemic. And part of the genesis of this was somebody shared like a news article from the New York Times of their first like publication of it recently on the like 42-year anniversary of that. and I was going through, actually, this was from July 3rd, 1981, where the headline just said, "Rare cancer seen in 41 homosexuals. Outbreak occurs among men in New York and California. 8 died inside of 2 years. Doctors in New York and California have diagnosed among homosexual men 41 cases of a rare and often rapidly fatal form of cancer. 8 of the victims died in less than 24 months after diagnosis was made. The cause of the outbreak is unknown." And just a little bit, about a month before that, was the first official notice of this by a professional, like, medical organization, when on June 5th, there was so the CDC puts out their first report where they're noting this, and that is really important astrologically,
Yeah.
to me, because that was right on a Saturn station. And just to draw the parallel in terms of, let me show some charts on the screen. So here's the Saturn-Pluto conjunction in Capricorn, which we only got one exact hit, and it was right at the beginning of 2020. And I think it was actually right around within a day or two of that, the New York Times also published an article about this mysterious sickness that was starting to be noted, and it was one of their first pieces of coverage of it. But we already know by that time that it's spreading, and within the few months, it's like a worldwide pandemic, and all of the lockdowns had taken place in March and April of 2020.
Just to add something to that, it was in November, right around Thanksgiving, that I first got wind of something happening in China. And so I started looking, some strange flu again. And so, and I knew the Saturn-Pluto conjunction was coming up very quickly. And I thought, oh, that's not good, right? So, and there were a number of people in the mundane astrology group that I'm in, who, when I brought it up, and they would say, yeah, I saw that too. Let's explore this. And so we were already saying this by December 30th is when we just said, oh, this is not going to go well. And people were predicting a pandemic already by December 30th. But yes, that mundane astrologers tend to keep their ear to the ground. we hear these things coming at us, and we're watching the news all over the world, and we're trying to pick up on things. And so there were a number of people talking about a coming pandemic already in December.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the astrologers were all, because everybody just saw all those alignments in Capricorn that just didn't look good, of all those planets, chiefly Saturn and Pluto. Previously in episode 254, Lisa Scheim and I documented how the French astrologer André Barbeau, who had done a whole study on previous pandemics, published a paper way back in 2012 where he predicted a pandemic in the 2020 through 2021 timeframe due to that Saturn-Pluto alignment, and how even other astrologers like Richard Tarnas in his book Cosmos and Psyche had documented the previous alignments of Saturn and Pluto with pandemics.
I mean, if you look back, I mean, and that's the thing, is like, one reason we thought another pandemic was coming was because of the Saturn-Pluto conjunction in Leo in the late 1940s that coincided with this horrendous polio pandemic that hit all worldwide. 50,000 children were dying a year between 1948 and 1952. And then in
there was another polio
1914. 1914, there was another polio outbreak, but then there was also the massive deaths in World War I, in the beginning of World War I. In that 2 or 3 month period, about 1 million men died. And also there was, at the time, within the military, on the ground in Europe, there was a flu that swept through. And I've read not recently, a few years ago, I read where they think that that was actually the originating flu that led to the 1918 pandemic. It because after Americans were sent to Europe for the war in 1917, and then some were infected and they came back at Fort Riley, Kansas, and it mutated there to turn into what it did then in 1918. But a lot of people, a lot of things I've read suggest that the flu probably actually started already in 1914 on the battlefield.
Interesting. And this is from Archetypal Explorer. For those watching the video version, it just shows a graph with the exact Saturn-Pluto hit was in 1914, but when you add a sort of the full orb to that of influence of, especially when they're roughly in the same sign together, you get a broader time frame that goes out a few years on either side of that exact conjunction in 1914. And I know one of the polio things, for example, is there was a major polio outbreak in 1916 in New York, and that was when Saturn and Pluto were still conjoined in Cancer.
Right. Yeah, because the Cancer conjunction took place at 2+ Cancer. So Saturn and Pluto were in Cancer then for the next 2 years.
Right. And that's one of the things I've learned in mundane astrology is just, even though there's a heightened intensity at the exact conjunction, really, as long as the two planets are in the same sign together, that conjunction is still active or operative.
Right. When the two planets are co-present, it doesn't matter whether they're conjunct or not. The minute they ingress, you've got a crisis when it comes to these conjunctions. And yeah, it does intensify. It does sort of get to a peak period during the conjunction. But as long as they're co-present in the sign, you're going to see that. And even after, I mean, it depends on what happens, because, like, for example, the Saturn-Pluto conjunction of 82 was at the end of Libra. So that conjunction bled over as well into Scorpio. It hit at 27 Libra, but then they were conjunct in Scorpio for 2 years.
Right. Yeah. So you end up getting this extended period from like 1981 to 1985, while Saturn is in Libra with Pluto and then in Scorpio with Pluto. So you get this chunk of time. And here's the graph for that for the 1980s for the Saturn-Pluto alignment. And just the periods in which it was closer, further away, and how it just sort of stretches that entire first half of that decade. And that really did end up being the period of the emergence and initial like public inkling about AIDS that eventually went into the full-blown awareness of it and attempts to identify and then begin to combat it.
Yeah. But that didn't happen in the United States actually until 1985. At the end of that horrendous cycle, it wasn't until 1985 that Reagan even mentioned the word AIDS. And then he only put in $190 million for research. He did very little in response to it. And that was, by 1987, the gay community was just outraged beyond belief that the government just essentially was wanted us to die through neglect. I mean, that's the only conclusion you could come to. It really wasn't until George W. Bush, believe it or not, he's the one who put massive amounts of money into AIDS research that we now have. Because of what he did, we now have the regimen and the medications that we do have, like PrEP. All of that came out of the research that started in the early 2000s with George Bush. And then he also extended all of that. He just turned it all over to parts of the world like Africa. He saved millions of lives in Africa by doing that. But in the 1980s, at the peak of that Saturn-Pluto conjunction, we got nothing from the United States government.
Right. So part of it was there was a perception, or sometimes, that it was only affecting the gay community, and therefore the government was slow to react, or to, especially the White House at the time with the Reagan administration, wasn't taking active steps. And actually, I even heard like this recording of a press conference where his um, chief of what is it, like communicator, his press communicator was just like being really derisive and saying like homophobic stuff and stuff like
Yeah.
that when a reporter would
Yeah.
ask about what they were doing about it.
Yeah, exactly. And they knew better. They knew different. They really did. They had data from Africa that showed that it was in Africa. It was primarily among straight people. It was women and children who were dying of AIDS, and and they had that information. So that sort of pleading ignorance, like they did. Oh well, and then also just saying it's a gay disease. I mean, that was part and parcel of their anti-gay, anti-LGBT policies in the 1980s, and they used the AIDS crisis as a way to attack the gay community.
Right. So you recently published an article on your website, GaryLorentzen.com, on your blog, titled Planetary Pairs and the Aspects in the 8 Phases of Their Synodic Cycle. And at one point you talk about the Saturn-Pluto alignments and what that combination is about, which might be worth mentioning here, just to give some context about like why we're talking about the Saturn-Pluto alignment and why symbolically that's kind of important. But you say Saturn-Pluto combinations signify transformation of governmental institutions and agencies, extreme political power struggles, epidemics, new statements of intent regarding economics and powers of government in controlling the economy. Historically, this conjunction has been accompanied by large losses of life, such as in 1982 and 2020. What else is relevant? Is there anything else that's relevant to mention here about Saturn-Pluto, since that's kind of the focus of a large part of this discussion about how it ties into the AIDS epidemic?
Well, yeah, I mean, you can just sort of extrapolate on on that little blurb that I put in there. There was that article was already getting extremely long and ended up being 10,000 words long. So I wasn't going to go into extreme depth. I just simply wanted to give people sort of a thumbnail sketch of what Saturn, Pluto, and all these different planetary combinations would likely affect in our world. I mean, think back to the Saturn, Pluto, Jupiter conjunctions in Capricorn, and think about the incredible transformations that our institutions, democratic institutions, our economic institutions, everything that was touched by the pandemic. And of course, it was in Capricorn too. So you have basically your governmental infrastructures that were, in play, and then the attacks on them, calling it the deep state, and that the deep state is the enemy of the people. That's the nature of the Saturn Pluto in Capricorn, right? It'll come out differently in different signs, right? And in Cancer, it had an awful lot to do with the rise of the second wave of the KKK and extreme nationalism in the United States. Of course, it was Cancer, right? And our institutions then started adopting that, shifting and changing to accommodate that. By the 1920s, it was perfectly okay to be a KKK member, and you could be a politician and you could sit in Congress, and no one, right. It was just considered normal.
Like so extreme forms of like nationalism as an outgrowth of that?
Outgrowth of the Saturn Pluto in Cancer. It's the Cancer thing that creates that kind of nationalism, in the same way that the Capricorn thing created the negative attitude towards government and governmental structures and institutions when Saturn Pluto went conjunct there. So yes, now it isn't just epidemics, but it certainly coincides with major epidemics every time we get that conjunction. So
right. So and then in the 1980s, then it happens in Libra and then Scorpio, and you get this major, the focal point ends up being like relationships and sexuality.
Right. Correct.
Okay.
And it is fascinating that as a result of that, and I mentioned it to you in a conversation we had previously, that completely shifted the way that gay men particularly viewed relationships, because for the first time we had to think about long-term relationships as a way to survive. That if we could stay HIV negative, and the only way to do that at the time was one, not to have unprotected sex, but also to limit our sexual partners. And so suddenly there was a very important shift culturally, that we began to value those. Instead of looking for a hookup, we started looking for boyfriends. Instead of looking for, a fun time out on an evening, we started looking to see asking, is that person relationship material for me? And that was a huge shift in the gay culture at the time. And to me, that's the Saturn, Pluto, and Libra, right? And like conjunct in Libra.
Yeah, for sure. And just a transformation, because it's also just coming out like a little over a decade from like that hippie generation in the late 60s and early 70s, and like the whole free love sort of generation in general. And then all of a sudden you just hit this wall with Saturn and Pluto, and there's a real existential like fears surrounding sex and sexuality.
Yeah. And so yes, you could say, and some people have argued that gay people became more conservative because, within a few years, I mean, like the human rights campaign started also in 1982, in, I believe, April 14th, 1982. And it didn't take long for them to promote the idea that gay marriage or same-sex marriage was something that we wanted to promote, and that would be a goal. And the HRC has fought for that ever since. And it's kind of hard not to look at that Saturn-Pluto conjunction in Libra and say, wow, there it is, that shift in culture, and then moving towards this conservative. And I say conservative because it does stabilize the subculture itself. It stabilizes society as a whole to sanction these relationships and actually give them legal status, and also in terms of public health, clearly that allowing same-sex couples to get married and have this permanent relationship and have this relationship with the government the same way that straight couples do is a phenomenally stabilizing shift in the way the country handles its relationship to the LGBTQ community.
Yeah, and I always think about that. I always remember that because it was actually almost exactly 8 years ago now, just before the last Venus retrograde in Leo, when the Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage under that Venus-Jupiter conjunction in late Leo that was very bright and visible in the sky at the time.
Yeah.
And then Venus went retrograde that summer, and there was this huge uptick basically of same-sex marriages. I think I've read stats saying that like 10% or something of all the couples that were married over the next 3 months were same-sex couples, which is amazing. And that would have been a really interesting, like that's an interesting Venus retrograde connection at that time.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it's cool. It's a cool little bit of mundane astrology, but even aside from that, or of same-sex marriage, like that, even that aside, even the legalization, and it seems like the emergence of AIDS put a lot of pressure to accelerate the push to receive similar like legal rights, because all of a sudden it was bringing up things like end of life care and different things like that same-sex couples just didn't have any coverage of.
None at all. They're not even visitation rights in the hospital, depending
Right.
on the hospital and the community you're in. But generally speaking, no, that was not.
Sure. So it's like, it's tricky because on the one hand, with these two topics, they're like separate things, like the AIDS epidemic versus gay rights, but they've really intersected in this major way in especially the early 1980s.
Right, exactly, and that's my point, that as horrible and awful as the pandemic was, as the AIDS we say epidemic, but it was a pandemic. It covered the entire world. I don't know why they still say AIDS epidemic and not pandemic, but yes, it forced a certain response from the gay community as well, not just from the government. We had to change. It was very clear that we had to change if we were going to save our lives. And both in terms of health and staying alive, but also in terms of our relationship with the state, with the capital S, the government, that if we were going to make it, if we were going to continue becoming a part of the fabric of society, then we were going to have to make some changes, and we were going to have to shift and do something more conservative, and leave the old 1960s and 70s behavior behind.
Mm. Yeah, I was surprised by there were even just like the legalization, like that there were still anti-sodomy laws on the books that were, that's not a euphemism, but it's like a broad like anti same-sex laws just in general on the books until 2003. That it wasn't until 2003 that the Supreme Court finally struck that down nationally. Right. And there was an attempt to do that in 1986, 86. But it was actually upheld surprisingly, which is
it was because of the way the Bowers case was argued in 1986.
Okay.
They took a risk in attacking the law, the sodomy laws, quote unquote, in a certain way that didn't work, that the Supreme Court didn't buy the argument. But with Lawrence v. Texas in 2003, they took a very different tack with it, and basically used the 14th Amendment and the assumption of a right to privacy that underlay in the Greenwald decision when it came to contraception, that underlay Roe v. Wade. And that's how Lawrence v. Texas was able to argue it, and the Supreme Court had to agree, given the precedent that was there. We'll see how that goes forward, because that precedent has been thrown out now. This current Supreme Court rejects the 14th Amendment as a basis for privacy in overturning Roe in the Dobbs decision. So we don't know where this is going to go. Leaves the door open to attack all civil rights. If they're not going to use the 14th Amendment to support civil rights, then I don't know what they use, because I don't know. But we can be optimistic, because states, if they do leave things to the states, then certain states are going to uphold civil rights for all of their citizens. Some won't, but.
Right. All right, so let's go back. I want to start at the very beginning when approaching this from mundane astrology to the very beginning of the AIDS epidemic, when it first started to become known. And part of our kind of operating procedure here is something, it's a really basic principle that I think most mundane astrologers learn pretty early on about planetary cycles, that usually when there's the conjunction of two outer planets, you see the start of a new era and the foundation of something, but then whatever that is grows and develops during the course of the synodic cycle between those two planets.
Right.
And especially there are key turning points after the conjunction at the first square, which is the 90-degree point, at the opposition between the two planets, which is the 180-degree point, and then at the waning square, which is the other 90-degree point before the cycle is eventually finished. So Saturn and Pluto are on about a 40-year cycle. So we'll kind of be looking at this from the perspective of starting in the early 1980s and how that conjunction happened at the beginning of the pandemic or epidemic, or whatever you want to call it, the AIDS epidemic, But then it played out in some pretty interesting ways over the course of the next 40 years to bring us to roughly where we're at basically today.
I would add that it's a developmental thing as well.
Mm.
In other words, what happens at the conjunction is going to tell you how to interpret that first quarter square. What happens at the first quarter square is going to tell you how to interpret what happens at the opposition. It's developmental. If this, then that. Okay.
So it refers back to itself.
Exactly. Because that conjunction, as you pointed out, it's a period of time when there are new intentions in regarding to the two planets that are put forth. There's a new plan in place, okay, or trying to be put in place. And what happens and how things develop during that period of time that they are conjunct determines what's going to happen at the square. Because really, you also have another phase in between. You have the crescent phase, 45 degree, before you hit that turning point in the 90 degree. So you have the new statements of intent at the conjunction. Then you have some resistance to those intentions at the 45 degree. And those who support the new intentions really have to mobilize their energy in order to keep that cycle going. The Saturn, let's say, what we're talking about, Saturn-Pluto. So when we look at the disease itself, if we want to say, okay, the AIDS is related to the Saturn-Pluto conjunction in Libra. If we look at the 45 degree and look at the time period that occurred, you would see resistance to doing anything about it. Okay. But there was motivation to move beyond that, push. The gay community kept pushing. By the square, the gay community was really pushing hard against the government. And they started gaining some political traction in the body politic to support the cause. And so it goes all the way around. So the first quarter square to me represents sort of a crisis in consciousness. The full phase is where it finally gets put into the body politic. Everybody's aware, and depending on what happened at the first quarter square, as long as, let's say the fight for a cure, the fight for developing some sort of medical regimen to solve it, we got that pretty much at the opposition. At the the next Saturn-Pluto conjunction in 2020, of course, then the whole thing shifted. But by the time we got through the first quarter, the last quarter square, we had a regimen of medication that was working for HIV positive people. So to me, you have to look at it developmentally that way.
Yeah, for sure. That was what I was finding as well, that the identification of AIDS basically happened at the conjunction in the 1980s, and it was brought into greater and greater awareness the closer you got to the exact conjunction, and things started being done about it. Like the seeds were laid for the entire cycle in the first half of the 1980s.
Right.
And then you had a really important turning point when Saturn went through Aquarius and squared Pluto, which was still in Scorpio in the early 1990s. And there was some, one of the things that happened, unfortunately, is at that point, it got worse because at the square, it started hitting the high point where the majority of deaths of males of a certain age were AIDS related, basically, and it became the leading cause of deaths, first among men and then later also among women for a period of time in the early 90s, around the time of the first square. But they
It was
also start.
also a time, but it was also a time where the scientists and pharmaceutical companies were finally putting something out there that did prolong life, right? And even though they didn't have a tremendous amount of money to work with, like the NIH or the CDC, um, the Clinton administration did start putting more money in the 90s to keep that going after that square.
Right, for sure. I also noticed that really close to, there's also, there are different phases in public awareness, but one of the things that happened in terms of raising public awareness was very close to the Saturn-Pluto square. December 22nd, 1983, the film Philadelphia, starring Tom Hanks, came out, where he was like a lawyer.
1993, don't you mean?
Yeah, sorry, what did I
Okay.
say? 83?
83. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Thanks for catching that. So yeah, December 22nd, 1993. And it was based on a true story, and it was the first major Hollywood film, at least, on AIDS. And it was just very close. I think Saturn and Pluto were within 3 degrees of each other at that time. Also around that time, 1995 through 96, the first protease inhibitor drugs were approved by the FDA, which was not long after that. So yeah, like you said, some of the drugs and other things like started being developed that would eventually become um, the sort of AIDS cocktails that we know today, that would successfully make it so that it ceased to be a death sentence and started being something that people would still live long and healthy lives with.
Right.
So that was at the square, and then because that was also, it became a major cause of death. But then eventually, once some of those drugs were developed in the um, mid 1990s. Actually, let's back up, because we kind of skipped over the first part, and I wanted to go back to that, and then we'll return back to the rest of the cycle, because I want to set up just the emergence of it.
Okay.
One of the things that happened that's like really striking is if you pull up a chart for June 5th, 1991, this is roughly when most like timelines like start roughly their chronology of AIDS starting to become known, basically,
Right.
in the United States. And one of the things that's really important that I noticed is that Saturn is stationing direct on this day in Libra. So it's the first direct station of Saturn since it ingressed into Libra
Right.
and became co-present in the same sign as Pluto just a little bit earlier. So this is kind of the first initial buildup to the Saturn-Pluto conjunction. And what you'll see is that on the other side of that station is the first real ramp up to the Saturn-Pluto conjunction. So here's an image that just shows where the direct
Right.
station is in 81. And then after that point, Saturn and Pluto start closing the distance and getting
Right.
really close. So there's this super helpful timeline that's available at hiv.gov, and it has this, it's titled A Timeline of HIV and AIDS. So it says for June 5th, it's the timeline literally starts on that day with June 5th. And it says the US Center for Disease Control publishes an article in its Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report. The article describes cases of a rare lung infection in 5 young, previously healthy gay men in Los Angeles. Los Angeles immunologist Dr. Michael Gottlieb and their colleagues report that all the men have other unusual infections as well, indicating that their immune systems are not working. 2 have already died by the time the report is published, and others will die soon after. This edition marks the first official reporting of what will later become known as the AIDS epidemic. So then it goes on June 5th, and it says the same day that that report is published, a New York dermatologist calls the CDC to report a cluster of cases of a rare and unusually aggressive cancer among gay men in New York and California. Like with the others, it's associated with people who have a weakened immune system. And then it says June 5th through the 6th, the Associated Press, the Los Angeles Times, and the San Francisco Chronicle report on the CDC article. Within days, the CDC receives reports from around the nation of similar cases of PCP, KS, and other opportunistic infections among gay men. So this is basically, for all intents and purposes, is the starting point, and just, seeing that and how close that is to the direct station of Saturn is really notable in terms of just seeing that as the build up to that conjunction and the initial inkling that this thing is out there, but they don't have any idea what it is yet at this point. They're just starting to see these patterns and these reports coming in.
Yeah. If I remember right, the first reporting of illness among gay men occurred in early to mid-May. In LA, it was early May. In New York, I believe it was in mid-May, that gay newspapers were reporting. They not doing actually investigative reporting, just saying, hey, something's going on out there. And as those reports then started filtering into the CDC, this becomes an issue for the CDC. And then they put out their report on the 5th, and they put their task force together 3 days later.
Got it. Okay. So there was already like prior reporting building up to this, and other things are feeding into it, since that was one of my questions, is like Saturn had been in Libra for just a little bit. So I'm sure there was like a build up even to this when it started to become reported in mainstream sources.
Right. But I do think that the Saturn station, that then thereafter Saturn starts moving fairly quickly towards conjunction, and within, because the conjunction then occurs on November 7th of 1982. So it's a year and a half or so in this buildup after the stationary direct, on June 5th of 81. That's important to me. I mean, I think you've obviously made it a central piece of your information regarding the cycle, the Saturn-Pluto cycle, that once it did go direct, once it went stationary direct, then that's when the government actually started moving for the first time. Even though reports had been coming in, it wasn't until the 5th of June that they, on the station, that they actually started moving.
Right. And maybe we should mention just like what it is, or explain AIDS briefly, and at least some of the symptoms and the things that they would have started to see at this point, which is that when the person got HIV, or what the distinction is even between like HIV and AIDS.
Yeah, well, HIV just means that you test positive to the virus, right? It doesn't mean that you are going to get sick. And I know men who tested positive who never came down with AIDS. So it's two different things. But the likelihood of being HIV positive and then developing AIDS is very high, especially in the 1980s, because there was no medical regimen to stop it.
What I was reading earlier today was that AIDS is like an advanced level of development of HIV when the immune system has become damaged so heavily that it's unable to fight off other types of
opportunistic diseases, right? Like various forms of cancer and dementia, and and whatever else that can come with it. But,
right. Or even like molds or things like that, that previously the body would just be able to fight off easily, suddenly are able to grow and just run amok in the body, which really causes all sorts of problems and sickness.
Yeah. And I think they have a good handle on it now, but then we had no idea what was going on and why. We didn't even realize it was a retrovirus until 1982. It took them a while to figure that out.
So, and one of the other things that also shows up sometimes is Kaposi sarcoma, or KS, which is like little like purple spots or blotches on the skin, right?
Yeah, it's basically a form of skin cancer, but Kaposi's sarcoma is was one of the key symptoms. Even though itself it's a disease, it's a key symptom of being HIV positive and having AIDS.
Got it. Okay. So let's see. So going back to our chronology. So when Saturn stations direct on June 5th, 1981, it then starts closing the distance with Pluto, and there start being like a number of developments during that time that are really crucial, and different reports that are coming in and different things like that that are happening over the course of the next several months. One of the important ones early in like 1982, on January 4th, 1982, is Gay Men's Health Crisis has its first meeting on January 4th, 1982. And this is one of the first, or this is the first American AIDS organization, and is volunteer driven. And that's eventually incorporated on June 30th, 1982. But it's kind of important that it's formed already there in early 1982.
Mm-hmm. And they did a masterful job. They really did, of all over the country, organizing volunteer, I would call them units, volunteering units, to go into hospitals and actually help take care of AIDS patients. There was such a fear of the AIDS patient. I mean, like they were in isolation, and you had, just like almost like COVID at first. So you had these volunteers, even though no one knew what was behind this disease, but they would go in and take care of AIDS patients, and do community outreach, and basically hand out real information that you otherwise were not going to get from the media or from the government. It just wasn't going to happen, not then.
Right. That's a really important point, though. And that's an interesting parallel with COVID, which is in the early days, they didn't know anything about it, and they didn't know how it was transmitted. And so then as a result of that, you do have a lot of stigma surrounding it, and you have a lot of weird attitudes. And that's one of the things during the course of the 80s that's a huge tension, is then, different, especially gay people are being deprived of like basic rights for very basic things, or just people that get developed HIV or AIDS were being deprived of basic rights to do things like later in the 80s, one of the legal battles ended up being a guy or a young boy that was denied the ability to go to school after he got AIDS through a blood transfusion.
Yeah, I think that's Ryan White. The kid's name is Ryan White. Yeah. That, unfortunately, that was really common way to react to people with AIDS. So that, unfortunately,
this is his birth chart. We actually have a time birth chart for Ryan White, and he had to have a legal battle to be able to like go to school. But Lisa Shine pointed out to me today, actually, that he had Saturn in Aries rising, and Saturn was in the third house in his chart. Which is kind of interesting because astrologers, especially modern astrology, associate the third house with school and like lower forms of education prior to college. And yeah, that literally became one of his major struggles, was being forced out of school and having to initiate a legal battle just in order to be able to attend school.
Yeah. Well, and it is in opposition to Neptune in the ninth. So there was a lot of legal confusion around his situation. It wasn't clear at all what was going on, and how and why. It was a travesty that he wasn't allowed to go to school, because obviously it's only you only contact it through sort of blood and body fluids. So that's a pretty easy thing to avoid. So it's just one of those really sad stories in the early days of the AIDS epidemic.
Yeah, and Saturn would have been transiting through Sagittarius at the time, around the time of his legal battles. So it was, it's interesting. It was opposing his Saturn in the third, but also going through the ninth house of legal matters.
Right.
Yeah, and he ended up, I think, being successful in challenging that, but ended up, I think, moving to a different part of the country in order to go to school.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
That's right.
yeah,
And then he, I think, I can't remember when he died, but it was, I think it was around 1990, early 91, maybe. I can't remember.
yeah, it was 1990, I believe, is when he died. He died April 8th, 1990.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah. So in his formal request to be readmitted to school was denied June 30th of 1985, and then he went through all sorts of legal battles subsequent to that.
Yeah.
So that's just one example of one story. But going back to 1981, 1982, we have the foundation of the first organization. By May, there was this whole Mars retrograde. Let me bring up the chart and show that, because in the early part of things, it seems like Libra is playing like a major role in the charts. And what we'll see in early 81 is that when Saturn was like inching closer to Pluto by 82, by the time we get into 82, and basically the end of the first year of this or the beginning of the second year of the pandemic, is Mars went into Libra and then also went retrograde in that sign in that year. So you ended up with this really extended period of a Mars Saturn Pluto conjunction. And that's really interesting because one, traditionally in like ancient astrology, before they had the outer planets, it was Mars Saturn conjunctions were the alignment that was associated with like plagues and pandemics and things like that. And it also means that the parallel with this time period in our time, especially once Mars actually caught up to and conjoined Saturn and Pluto in mid 1982, that the parallel would be March, April of 2020, which is when Mars came up and conjoined Saturn and Pluto in Capricorn and Aquarius, right there in the very beginning and during the very height of the COVID lockdowns and everything else. Right. So if you sort of pull up a timeline to see what's going on during this period, we get this whole string of stuff where it's fully recognized at this time. So for example, May 11th, the New York Times publishes the first mention of the term quote unquote gay-related immune deficiency, which some researchers at that point are using to describe the new epidemic. And the term will deepen the public perception that AIDS only affects gay men, is what the HIV.org timeline says. Additionally, May 31st, the Los Angeles Times publishes the first front page story on AIDS in the mainstream press, titled "Mysterious Fever Now an Epidemic." June 18th, the CDC publishes an article, "A Cluster of Kaposi Sarcoma and Pneumonia Among Homosexual Men Residents of Los Angeles and Orange County Communities." And it makes the first connection between a potentially sexually transmitted agent and the outbreak of KS and other opportunistic infections among gay men. So what's interesting about this is this story on June 18th is right on another Saturn station again. There it is. We see Saturn stationing at 15 Libra on the same day. And this is like the first time that they're starting to like make these connections, at least in some of like the medical and other literature, in still trying to figure out what this is and how it's happening and what's going on. And we're seeing this happen again at another Saturn station where it's going to start closing the distance with Pluto, but now we see Mars there at the same time, and it's intensifying and things are getting worse, and it's starting to grow exponentially.
And that's also mid-June is when the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, came out and said that they were going to have, well, they didn't even have a name for the disease at this point, right? Mm-hmm. It wasn't until July 27th of 1982, the NIH, and they scheduled this meeting in mid-June to occur on July 27th, where they were going to hash this out. They had a number of potential candidates for the disease, to name the disease, but ultimately it became AIDS on July 27th of 1982. sometime in
Yeah.
mid-afternoon.
So that's crucial. And I know Christopher Renstrom at the first Queer Astrology Conference gave a talk on the Saturn return of AIDS, which at the time back during the conference was when Saturn had returned to Libra in the early 2010s. But I know he talked about researching this and getting a time for that chart of when that meeting took place.
And
and
he
when
came
they
up with 2 p.m. Yeah.
2 p.m.
Right. Well, I mean, the meeting had started much earlier in the day, but they had broken for lunch, and they came back. I went looking after. I remember that I was there for Chris's lecture, and I took note of that. Okay, 2 p.m. I want to go check that. So they came back from lunch and started the session, the afternoon session, at 1:45. So 2 o'clock seems to be an appropriate time for that, except it, from everything that I found, from 1:55 until about 2:35, is there was something going on with the name. Whether they started at 2 p.m. or 1:55 p.m. or 2 p.m., it looks like the entire process of the naming piece of that meeting didn't end until a little bit after 2:30. And that's what I came up. Now, I couldn't find any specific details with it. This is based on commentary that I heard that reported in news and different places. And the National Institutes of Health actually had they put out a journal, and I know it was in there. They didn't give a time, but they did say mid-afternoon. Okay. But in my research, Chris had it right, in my opinion, that about that 2 p.m. hour is when they came up with the name of AIDS.
Okay. Yeah, and people can read this article of Christopher's. It's actually a published book at this point. It's titled Queer Astrology Presentations from the Queer Astrology Conference, San Francisco, July 2013, edited by Ian Waisler and Rhea Wolf. And the title of his article is The Saturn Return of AIDS. And it's a really great article where he uses this chart and expands on it and talks about its relevance more. But here's the, roughly the alignment, and we can just see that Mars, Saturn, Pluto conjunction pretty close at that point, where Saturn is at 16 Libra, Pluto's at 24 Libra, and Mars is at 26 Libra. Yeah, so AIDS had finally been named at that point. And even earlier, just, back to that period when Saturn was stationing, on June 27th, a gay activist group in San Francisco published the first pamphlet on safer sex and distributed 16,000 copies at the International Lesbian and Gay Freedom Day Parade. So there's starting to be those discussions about like safe sex and how to deal with this, and a sort of raising awareness about how to protect yourself and be safe.
Yeah.
Then on July 16th, the first report of immunosuppression in patients with hemophilia who have no other known risk factors for AIDS comes out. And there's 2 or 3 patients that are profiled in the report had already died by the time of publication. So at this time during that summer, when the Mars, Saturn, Pluto conjunction is happening in Libra, they're also basically the medical establishment is starting to realize that it's also affecting hemophilia patients. And they're realizing not only that, but that also that it could be sexually transmitted all around this time. So this is really crucial because they're really starting to figure out and also name what this is around the time of the Mars, Saturn, Pluto conjunction. And that's almost the exact parallel for the March, April timeframe with the COVID pandemic, when Mars, Saturn, and Pluto are lining up in Capricorn and Aquarius at the same time. And they're very quickly figuring out that it's like an airborne, illness that's being transmitted through the air.
Yeah. That, I can remember it so clearly. How is this thing transmitted? It was a constant conversation and a concern. Is it airborne? Is it, what is it? Is it sexual disease? What is it? Is it? No one knew,
In the early 1980s, you mean?
Yeah, no one knew. In 81 and 82, no one knew. Um, it was in 1982 that I first, it was really after the NIH thing and calling it AIDS when I first started reading about how it was transmitted, and first had an understanding of how it was transmitted. And of course, then that immediately changed my sexual behavior. And it also
When was that again? Sorry, could you say that
82.
again? 82. Okay.
Yeah. And
you're in Seattle at this point?
yeah, I was in Seattle.
Okay.
And then the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, of course, hits right near my 7th house cusp at the end of Libra in 82. And I made the decision that I was going to have to, friends, people knew that I was gay, but not professionally, not at work, and not within the astrological community. So right after that conjunction, and as it moved across, as both planets moved into Scorpio and across my moon and Mars, I started coming out within the astrological community in 1983. And also at that time I was teaching high school as well. And I started coming out at work as well. So that was a huge push for me, that personally.
You wrote in your article that you and your friend made a conscious decision to do that because you thought it was important to raise awareness at that time because of what was going on.
That actually happened later. I started coming out, but like I said, I didn't get a positive response in the astrological community. But I didn't shy away from telling people. But it really wasn't until Bruce Hammerslaw in the late 80s, and I think it might have been 87, 88, somewhere in there, where he actually announced it at NORWAC. If I remember right, it was NORWAC when he stood up and said, "I'm HIV positive and I have AIDS." Of course, Richard Eideman's suicide because he was HIV positive, that really struck home, I think. And that was also, gosh, I don't remember when that was, the late 80s, I believe. That really hit people hard. And I think that's when people started finally listening. And being gay within the astrological community was, suddenly it wasn't such a bad thing. And people started listening to us, and there was some empathy.
Looks like the date, according to Astrodata Bank, was that Richard Eidemann may have found out that he had AIDS in June of 85 and that he passed away in February of 1987.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's right in the thick of it. And you said that because he was a major psychological astrologer, a very influential psychological astrologer. And you said that
brilliant teacher. He was a brilliant astrological teacher too. That was his forte was, he had a tremendous charisma and presence in front of people, and he could teach astrology like no one else, as far as I was concerned back then. And so his loss hit the community extremely hard in 87.
Yeah, like I'm trying to think of a parallel without naming names, but just in order to convey the enormity of that, or what that would be like to contemporary astrologers, is just like, pick out your 10 most influential or favorite teachers or astrologers that you know of today that are hugely influential due to their books or their podcasts or YouTube channels or what have you, and then just take 3 or 4 of them and say that they pass away and they're no longer there all of a sudden, to sort of like convey what that would be like, and to lose those voices very suddenly.
Yeah. And that's really what it was like. It was shocking. And there was an emptiness, there was a void, as they started, as our gay astrologers started leaving, but like I said, I think the Richard Eidemann case was the one that really hit home within the community, because he was such a standout superstar at the time. And yeah, in a way, it was sort of like, the Rock Hudson thing, and from in terms of the nation's reaction to Rock Hudson dying. For the astrological community, that Richard Eidemann doing that, I mean, dying like that because he was HIV positive, that just it was a shocking thing.
Yeah. Rock Hudson, he was like a famous actor, and he was one of the first actors to come out and be very public that he had AIDS.
Right. And
Okay.
and most of the public didn't know that he was even gay, although anyone in the gay community knew he was gay and had known for decades. I mean, it was not a secret in Hollywood that Rock Hudson was gay, and we knew who his boyfriends were. I mean, he lived with Randolph Scott for a very long time. So I mean, but the public, it's so funny because you can hide, quote unquote, hide right out in public, and people don't even know what it is they're looking at. And that was the case with Rock Hudson. The public just didn't really understand what they were looking at because he was such a macho kind of guy, hyper masculine and extremely handsome. And but that was a lesson for the country in terms of, like, the orientation of homosexuality has nothing to do with whether you're a cisgendered person or a femme person or anything like that. It's just, it doesn't signify necessarily. Right.
Right. So here's his Rock Hudson's chart, because we have a time chart. It's November 17th, 1925 at 12:15 a.m. in Winnetka, Illinois.
Right. Winnetka.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so I didn't necessarily have anything to mention, but he made that announcement in 1985. So it's like a few years into it, but that's still very early on. And he was one of the first actors like that. So it's like that was both surprising to the public, both in that he was coming at it as gay, and then also, saying that he had AIDS at the same time. But that was something that more and more celebrities over the course of the next decade were pushed to do and felt a need to do.
Initially pushed to do, and that had a lot to do with ACT UP. That it became clear to most people in the gay community that silence did equal death. If you were not going to come out, if you were not going to let people know, and you're going to hide this, you're going to end up dying as a result. And you're going to end up killing other people. I mean, if you're going to keep this to yourself, and there's the shame with it, and there's the whole burden of it, and you're not going to let anybody know, that psychologically just creates bad behavior. And we saw that. And so being silent was not an option after 1987. Okay, so it was a matter of pushing people to come out, and so they actually created, the National Coming Out Day, and trying to get gay people to come out no matter where they were and take the risk. And it was effective because suddenly the whole country realized, oh my gosh, my butcher is gay, or this guy over here is gay, this woman over here is a lesbian, my son's teacher is gay, or it just became like, wow, there are gay people everywhere. And of course they always have been, but circumstances being the way they were, you couldn't come out, not without risking persecution, prosecution, incarceration, and even, being castrated for so many years.
Right. The famous like Alan Turing, for example, in the 1950s was a famous example of a gay man who had done a lot to help them break the Nazi codes, like German codes during the war effort in World War II. But then afterwards, because he was found to be a gay man, they ended up like chemically castrating him.
Right. Exactly. And they were doing that in the United States, going back to the first state to do that was the state of Oregon in 1917. They passed this draconian law that 10 years in prison and sterilization, they called it. Okay. However, that was going to be done. By 1923, every single state, all 48 states in the United States, had very similar laws on the books. And so that, and then also they were, the FBI, their vice squads infiltrated gay communities all across the country and shut them down and arrested people and closed down businesses. And there used to be, prior to 1917, there were gay neighborhoods and gay businesses, and they were quite out in the open. Here in Portland, we had, my gosh, there were 3 exclusively gay hotels. There were nightclubs and bars and everything, and that all got shut down after 1917. And it was like that all the way across the country. So that created the closet, the very idea that you're at risk of going to prison for 10 years and being sterilized. You're not coming out. You know, you're not going to live that open life anymore.
Right. You actually risk like real serious legal and like financial and also just like personal danger.
Exactly.
If you do. So there's like a real legitimate fear and reason not to, or reason to keep it private.
Yeah, exactly. But then that also created the circumstance for something like AIDS to take hold within that insulated community, right? Because they, it was very incestuous in so many ways. Everybody had friends with benefits, and that became sort of a petri dish for the AIDS virus, you know, for the HIV. Because once it hit, then because it was that insulated, and you didn't move outside of that, not without risking imprisonment and sterilization. So you stayed within it. So it was a perfect opportunistic disease to hit that kind of insulated subgroup within the country. But that was created by the country itself. They didn't have to do that. They didn't have to create this horrendous closet and for gay people like they did starting in 1970.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, if you can't even, for example, in the instance you mentioned of the astrologer at one point where he had to use sort of like code words in order to see if you were also gay, like he was, if you can't even, you know, use open language to talk about your orientation, then much less be able to talk about you know, I don't know, talking about what's going on or practicing safe sex or other things like that.
Yeah, it's all part and parcel of the same sort of cultural phenomenon, right? Once you're closeted and threatened with 10 years imprisonment and sterilization, that takes a psychological toll, right? And you get self-protective, and as a result, you had gay ghettos that developed in American cities all across the country. In Seattle, it was the west side of Capitol Hill. You know, in Chicago, it was, you know, the Boys Town. Philadelphia, it was the neighborhood. I mean, you had these gay sort of enclaves, and the only people who lived there were gay men. And that's why the HIV and the AIDS epidemic was able to take hold so quickly and spread so quickly, because they were in those insulated communities, and they lived their lives there. They worked there. They socialized there. They lived there. Everything was in there. You didn't go outside. Before Stonewall, you simply didn't get out there in public and put yourself out there that way.
Mhm. Right. All right, so let's go back to our chronology. So we mentioned when the name was first established in that private meeting, and that was the chart that Christopher Renstrom uses. Then that group, though, eventually, for the first time, uses the name AIDS publicly in a publication on September 24th, 1982. And this was Mercury had just gone retrograde just 5 days earlier in Libra, conjunct Saturn and Pluto, Saturn at 22 Libra and Pluto at 25 Libra.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it just keeps activating those. If I animate it, actually, if I back it up, you can see that station just 4 or 5 days earlier. Oh, wow, actually, it was right. The moon was like swooped through
right
there
there.
at the same time.
Yeah.
So Saturn's within 3 degrees at this point, and then after that, one of the things that's actually really important is September 28th, around this time, as Saturn and Pluto are growing closer together. There were 2 representatives that it says in the chronology joined together to introduce the first legislation to allocate funding for AIDS research, but the resolution died in committee, and Congress will not approve the first dedicated funding for AIDS research and treatment until July of 1983. So this is really important because one of the things I noted that this is near this first attempt at getting funding in Congress happened near the first conjunction of Saturn and Pluto. But what happens is there's a retrograde and that conjunction comes back closer to June. And it's at that point that the funding is actually eventually approved.
But it was minimal. I mean, it was, it didn't do anything, to be honest. Congress was acting, but the Republicans, they just, the amount of money that was asked for it, they didn't get. They only got a fraction of it. And some of it, they did get some, right? The first congressional action to put money into the research. But it was woefully less than what they needed to do anything.
Right. And to like stem the tide of this thing that was just growing and growing exponentially.
Yeah.
Let's see. Later, November time jump here. I just want to make sure my chronology is right. So Saturn goes into Scorpio. So we're still in 82 at this point, but now we're starting to get into 83. So one of the things that happens, and this is near the first conjunction, let me animate the chart to show that. Okay, we see Saturn towards late 82, getting all the way up, and then eventually conjoining Pluto here. Looks like on November 7th, November 8th, 1982, we get that exact Saturn-Pluto conjunction. So this becomes the sort of center point of everything at that point. Sorry, the November CDC's current trends, acquired immune deficiency syndrome, precautions for clinical staff and laboratory staff, lays out the first set of precautions for clinical and laboratory staff working with people exhibiting signs of AIDS. In December, there's a paper published that notes a 20-month-old infant who required multiple blood transfusions at birth, who's developed unexplained cellular immunodeficiency and opportunistic infections. Donor tracing reveals that one of the baby's blood donors died of AIDS in August. So with this story and the next one, they basically start realizing that it's infecting infants around this time. December 7th of 82, reports of AIDS hinting at transmission via pregnancy. There's 22 cases of unexplained immunodeficiency and opportunistic infections in infants. So this is all around the time of the first conjunction. And then finally in January 7th of 83 now, they report the first cases of AIDS in women. So this one's really important on January 7th. And let me pull up the chart for that because I believe this is where there is a station. There it is. So this is one of the first Mercury stations that I noticed, where you'll notice that Mercury is moving direct and then it stations retrograde on this day on January 7th, 1983, and Venus comes up and exactly conjoins it.
Yeah.
So you get this really striking alignment. And on the other side, so Venus and Mercury are conjoining at 2 degrees of Aquarius, and they're squaring Saturn at 3 degrees of Scorpio, which is still very closely conjunct Pluto at 29 degrees of Libra. So what happens at this point is the first reported cases of AIDS in women are published basically by the CDC in January 7th. And they start realizing that this is not something that's just restricted to gay men, but they instead, right around the same time, they're basically realizing that it's affecting people with blood transfusions as well as was women as well.
Yeah. It's right around the time of the conjunction is when they finally realized that it was essentially bloodborne and body fluid. That's where the transmission occurred. So anyone was at risk, and male, female, child, it doesn't matter, adult, it doesn't matter. Anyone can be exposed to this and come down with HIV and AIDS. It wasn't just a gay disease, and it goes back to what I was saying earlier, that it hit the gay community first and exploded there because we were an insulated group, right? And our sexual behavior centered within that community. Like I said, we all had friends with benefits. That helped it spread. But now, and because they were only looking at that and they weren't looking outside of those communities, they were missing a very important piece until we get really close to it. Like in November, we get really close in that conjunction. Well, you get the exact conjunction on the 7th. And then we are seeing, oh, wait a minute, we've got infants, we've got little babies being born that are HIV positive. How is that? How does that happen? And then we find out in January that, in fact, women are also HIV positive. So then that changes everything. It changes everybody's perspective. It within the medical community, at least. I mean, it still took American society many years to get over the prejudice of AIDS and HIV being a gay disease. It took a lot more time and many more deaths of women and children for American society to understand, wow, it's not a gay disease.
Yeah, there's something really important that happened around this time that I think is really illustrative for astrologers, which is it really made me think of this exact conjunction. And when it started around the time of the exact conjunctions between Saturn and Pluto, it came into sight with the public, like what this actually was and what they were dealing with. Because it reminded me how in ancient astrology, the term aspect originally meant to see something, and it had to do with ancient optical theories about when something was directly in front of your line of vision and you were looking right at it, that's what an exact aspect is like. But when something's just off to the side or just sort of in your peripheral vision, that's what an aspect that's not fully, that's just barely an orb, or is like a sign-based aspect is like, is something that's in your peripheral vision, but you don't have your exact focus on that exact thing. But one of the things we kind of see with this is that as soon as that aspect between Saturn and Pluto, once they come into the same sign and it started becoming an orb in 1981, you start getting the first inklings where like humanity collectively starts to see this in their peripheral vision. But it's not until around the time of the exact conjunctions in 82 and 83 that it's fully recognized with clarity what this is and how to start dealing with it. And there's something really, really interesting there that's really illustrative, I think, for astrologers about how aspects work.
Yes, particularly when we're dealing with mundane social events like this. And I mean, I hate that word mundane because it's, it means worldly, but it has this other connotation of being boring and not interesting. But the reality is that any disease, any pandemic is actually a crisis, an event within the world, okay, and that people have to deal with. And so the aspect that is two planets seeing each other, or even we as people looking out at the two planets and seeing them in an exact relationship, mathematical relationship, does, I think, I agree with you 100%. It does expand our awareness about what's going on with those two planets, even if we aren't, savvy to or privy to astrology and what those planets supposedly mean. We see it in our everyday lives, the way it works. And so, yes, the science was proving that this was not a gay disease, and that becomes clear with the conjunction and the time very in the year following the exact conjunction.
Yeah, let's actually get to that now. But that's just crazy to me, or that's so fascinating to me, that it has to do with awareness, that like humanity's awareness of something comes into focus at this time, of something really bad that's like killing a lot of people, but it's not even, and there's increasing levels of people dying. But it seems like what it's describing, what the alignment is describing at that time, is also both that the pandemic is being fully unleashed, but also that we're becoming aware of it and it's being named in some sense.
Right. It's being named and understood, beginning to be understood.
Right.
And so when we watch then after the conjunction, as Saturn moves forward and goes into these relationships, for these, let's say, aspects as it moves forward, aspects to Pluto, and also aspects to the degree of the conjunction, that we start seeing that awareness increase. There's always more and more awareness as Saturn was further away from Pluto.
Right. So here's January that we were just talking about of 83. So Saturn's at 3 Scorpio, Pluto's at 29 Libra, and I'm going to move the chart forward in time, and eventually we see Saturn station retrograde in Scorpio around February 12th, and then it starts moving backwards towards Pluto again over the next several months, eventually making a retrograde ingress back into Libra here around May of 1983. So May of 1983, and then eventually we see Saturn slow down, and it stations within 1 degree of Pluto on this date about July 1st, 1983. So this is the second time that they'll get the closest they'll ever get to an exact aspect on July 1st of 1983. So aside from that conjunction the exact conjunction in late 82, this is the other closest conjunction that Saturn and Pluto will ever have, at least in that cycle of the Saturn-Pluto conjunctions. And this really interesting string of events happens around that time. So one of them is that in May, 2 men living with AIDS publish a booklet on safer sex titled How to Have Sex in an Epidemic, One Approach. And it advocates condom use for gay men and focuses on self-empowerment for those living with AIDS. Then around this time on May 18th, the US Congress passes the first bill that includes funding specifically targeted for AIDS research and treatment, which is only $12 million for agencies within the US Department of Health and Human Services, which is just pitifully low, but that is the first time that the government starts like allocating funds.
Yeah. And that's what I'm saying. It's like when that happened, everybody in the gay community said, "Are you kidding us?
Right.
That's a joke. Come on, we're dying here." And you put $12 million into it. It was obscene.
Yeah, because what it ends up needing later in time is just like billions and billions of dollars in order to fund the research and the drugs and the other things that would eventually lead to progress in fighting this. But this was just like a drop in the bucket at the beginning.
Yeah.
So that happens next on May 20th. There's a researcher, Dr. Francois Barr, and her colleague at the Pasteur Institute in France report the discovery of a retrovirus that could be the cause of AIDS. in 2008, she'll share the Nobel Prize in medicine for this discovery with her colleague, Dr.
Yeah.
Luc Montagnier. So this is when they discovered that it was a retrovirus. Virus was around the time of the second conjunction,
Yep.
basically.
In
So
83.
they, yeah, in 83. So they discover what it is. Then on May 25th, the New York Times publishes the first front page story on AIDS, with the title Health Chief Calls AIDS Battle #1 Priority. This article reports on the federal responses to the growing AIDS epidemic. By the time it's published, 1,450 cases of AIDS have been reported, and 558 of those individuals have died. This report's actually really interesting and important because on May 25th, the day this came out, Mercury actually stationed direct. So it's like the New York Times finally does a cover story on this. And again, it's this weird thing that has to do with awareness, but it's like Mercury stations direct on that day in Taurus. And, finally on the New York Times, one of the epicenters for what's happening, there's a front page report on it.
Yeah.
All right. So other things that are happening during that time. The other one I wanted to mention is July 4th, 1983. And this is, just 3 days after that Saturn station, within a degree of Pluto, is the first Time magazine cover about AIDS. And Time magazine was one of the biggest magazines, like print magazines at the time. So this is pretty huge, having it cover it with a front page story.
Yeah, I remember that. July 4th and July 5th of 1983 were also, and I remember it because it was a very important time for me personally. And when that came out on the cover of Time magazine, it was like, okay, now hopefully people are going to start paying attention. I mean, real attention. And there was a hope. I know I talked to other gay men at the time, and there was a hope that that this would create the awareness needed in Congress, particularly, to get real funding. Of course, that did not happen, but that was the hope, and that was what we were all focused on at the time. But that's when July 5th is July 4th. Yeah, I remember I said I was changing my behavior, and so the first sort of real long-term boyfriend happened on July 5th of 1983 for me. Of course, like I said, my 28, 29 degrees of Libra is my 7th house cusp. And so that conjunction, Saturn-Pluto conjunction, moving across that changed everything and changed.
That's wild. And that was your first boyfriend, and it was happening in your 7th, at least your 7th whole sign house.
Right.
So your Aries rising. So yeah, and that Saturn station was right there in your 7th. So that's pretty, so yeah, you have very then striking, or not just striking, but vivid memories of that exact time period.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Wow. Okay. So Saturn stationing. And so there was a real hope that it was finally starting to like get out there in the mainstream press, and that somebody would start doing something about it.
Yep. That was the hope. Of course, we were very disappointed. It didn't really happen that way. It didn't happen that way at all.
So one more thing.
We did get, yeah, go ahead.
Just one more thing. A month later, on August 8th, 1983, Bobby Campbell and Bobby Hillard appeared on the cover of Newsweek's story, which was titled Gay America, Sex, Politics, and the Impact of AIDS, where the first time 2 gay men were shown embracing on the cover of a mainstream national magazine also happened basically just a month later around that time. So there's this continued like interlinking of these things.
Yeah. And to be honest, there was also a feeling that because we were being identified as gay America, we weren't being hidden anymore by the mainstream media. It was like everybody it was like coming out, so to speak, to have that on the front cover. It was like saying, wow, America is going to start seeing this. And it became important. And that's why I was saying it was around that time, sort of meeting my first real real relationship, boyfriend, and having all of this come out right as we were dealing with AIDS, right? We were dealing with this horrendous epidemic that we knew was going to get worse, and yet there was this optimism that we are finally visible, that we don't have to be in the closet anymore. It's on Newsweek, we're right on the cover of Newsweek. It psychologically, it was very uplifting.
Wow, I just realized something. Well, two things. One, so I'm looking at the chart for that Newsweek cover, August 8th, 1983. Here's the chart. And one, it's just so striking, the cover story and the way it's titled. It's Gay America, Sex Politics, and the Impact of AIDS, and just the interlinking of those two things. And we just see the the focal point being that Saturn-Pluto conjunction in the sign of Libra, and just the intertwining of like relationships and sexual orientation, but also in the midst of this really terrible epidemic that's focused on, or has put the focus on the gay community, or is affecting it heavily at that time. But something I just noticed is Venus is retrograde in Virgo right here. This is in 1983, and it just stationed retrograde at the beginning of August, on August 2nd, 1983. But then it would retrograde. This was part of the series when Venus was still starting its retrograde in Virgo, but then falling back into Libra. So it would eventually
into Leo. Yeah.
Or sorry, yeah, into Leo. Thank you. So it would station direct in Leo, September 16th of 1983.
Mars.
That means this was the same Venus retrograde, the same series that occurs in 8-year increments that would later, the Venus retrograde that would happen that summer that I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, the summer of 2015, when Venus went retrograde in Virgo and Leo, the summer that same-sex marriage was legalized.
Right.
So it's the same Venus retrograde. That's incredible. I never had made that connection by going back that far to that first Newsweek cover to see that it went back, that like basically like gay rights were tied into that Venus retrograde for even longer than I realized.
I remember seeing that, but it kind of just went out of my mind until you just brought it back, and suddenly, yeah, that's absolutely right. Because I was watching carefully and the Supreme Court arguments and all of that sort of thing in 2015 related to same-sex marriage, and I noted that the Venus retrograde in Virgo going back into Leo. But I didn't at the time. I didn't until just now. I didn't make that connection either to the other one.
It's not like something you would immediately assume would be connected with that inherently in some way, or it doesn't like stand out. It's only by paying attention to the events that it coincides with in those 8-year intervals that you realize there's like a pattern or a connection of some sort.
Right.
And
sometimes it takes a little step back and some historical perspective to see it, right in the middle of it. You don't think back that far.
Yeah. Well, then that's kind of the issue with all of these things, is that sometimes things happen. You'll see an astrological thing happening at the time, but you don't fully understand what it's correlating with or what the importance is at the time. And it's only later, by looking back in retrospect, once you have a broader view, that you fully understand the significance of all those alignments at the time.
Yeah, and realizing that they are part of larger cycles, not just the alignments, right? That there is a cyclical pattern to all of these things, and that is it's brilliant that you were able to just see that right now, because like I said, I had not noticed it, even though I was watching all of that very carefully at the time and wrote about it. I missed that it was the same Venus retrograde pattern.
Yeah, well, it's something that's happening this summer, and I keep thinking about it. I've been puzzling about it a lot lately, because I was curious in what way, since I knew this same-sex Supreme Court decision happened in 2015 under that Venus retrograde, how that would come up again this summer. And it just seemed like it was weird, because it seemed like it has been coming up again recently, but in a reversal sense where there's been more pushback against LGBT things recently, like with the recent Supreme Court decision about like the website thing and other things like that, so that there was a connection, but it's been this weird connection that's not necessarily positive in this instance.
Right. I would agree with you. Yeah, that's true. There's another pattern that's involved here, and I mentioned it to you in the document that you had me edit, and that is, this does deal with sexual orientation generally, and pretty much that is the larger umbrella, conceptual umbrella that we're dealing with here when we're talking about, in this case, the AIDS epidemic. But ultimately, this falls under this umbrella of sexual orientation. And if we go back to the first time the word homosexual was coined and actually used, which was on the evening of May 6th of 1868, that to me is the beginning of the modern concept of sexual orientation. And it happened to be, there was a full moon that night at 16 degrees of Scorpio, opposing Pluto at 15 degrees of Taurus. Now, I don't know if you've been watching, but a lot of these charts you're putting up have the 15 degrees of, have the mid degrees of fixed signs, whether Leo, Aquarius, or Taurus and Scorpio. They fit right in there. And the Sun-Pluto conjunction in 1868 on that evening, opposing the moon, is something that repeats constantly over and over in these charts that deal specifically with homosexuality.
What was the date on that again?
Uncanny. May 6th, 1868. And there's a full moon in Scorpio that night at 7. Now, Brennan was writing from Hanover, Germany. So that would be, and it was local mean time. There
it is.
Yeah.
So it's a full moon at 16 Scorpio opposite the sun at 16 Taurus, which is conjunct Pluto at 15 Taurus.
Yeah. And but it also had the actual full moon had 15 degrees Scorpio rising as well. So it was right on the horizon. The full moon was right on the horizon.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Later that evening, right? And that's when Brennan was writing his letter to Karl Ulrichs, explaining why he didn't like Ulrich's formulation of a Uranian to identify a gay man. And he said we should be calling same-sex couples homosexuality as opposed to heterosexuality. So that's the first modern conception, and we've used that term ever since. Okay, so that's the first modern conceptualization of sexual orientation. The very idea that there is even a sexual orientation. That's the first time it's actually put into words. And that, if you watch that chart over time, it's really quite stunning. Transits to it, as well as even progressing it.
Can you give me the data again? Because I had it just set for Washington, D.C., but let me get...
yeah. Let me see if I can pull it up.
Okay.
Let me see if I got it here.
What was the city?
Hanover, Germany.
Let's see. So yeah, if I cast it for like 7 p.m., you get the moon on the ascendant. The full moon's almost exact at like 16 Scorpio.
Yeah, so it's 7:16 p.m. local mean time in Hanover. And it's got 14 Scorpio on the ascendant, 15 Pluto at 15 Taurus, Sun at 16 Taurus. And that I fall back on that chart a lot to and watch it, how it works. And you will find, I mean, all of the decisions, Lawrence v. Texas, the Obergefell case with same-sex marriage, uh, there's this incredible pattern of consistent pattern of mid-fixed degrees that are really important in these issues that relate to sexuality.
Okay, got it. Yeah, I was just looking at that station for that New York Times article, but the direct station was at 16 Taurus.
See,
And
it's fascinating that how that works.
right. And that was when the New York Times published its first front page story on AIDS, basically.
Mhm.
Okay. That's really cool. All right, so we're back, and I want to follow up on the Venus retrograde thing, because I actually take that back, because I don't think I was thinking about that more, and we talked about it on the last forecast about this Venus retrograde, and I said earlier, just a little bit ago, that I didn't understand why this Venus retrograde, this particular one, would be tied in with like same-sex marriage or other things like that. And I actually do think it makes sense in a way. And we talked about this in the last forecast, because it's a Venus retrograde in Leo. And one of the things that Leo is really good at from a psychological perspective is like being authentic to yourself, and like self-authenticity, and like being who you are. And I think there may be something about that, if it's not just tied in with um, the synodic cycle itself through a series of repetitions, independent of the signs of the zodiac. If it is tied in with the signs of the zodiac, perhaps it's due to that connection with Leo and something about self-authenticity, which really is a lot about what coming out is. It's the
Right.
ability to be authentic publicly with the world rather than just privately to yourself.
Right. And I would agree. I think the especially Venus and Leo, because there is an evaluation of that authenticity and that self-promotion. So that would make sense to me. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Maybe that could be it, but this might be a good reason for other people to go back and, I'm sure, research this Venus synodic cycle, because I'm sure there's other ones that we're overlooking like earlier in that series that could be really interesting. So if anybody finds any other ones, I hope they'll let us know in the comments. Okay, so back to the chronology. So later in November of 1983, let me see where Saturn and Pluto are, just to get, because we start going from this point. We're pretty soon heading into the full Saturn in Scorpio and eventually Pluto in Scorpio territory, where Saturn departs from Libra and moves into Scorpio in August and September of 1983. And eventually Pluto follows suit and also moves into Scorpio in November of 1983. So at this point, November 22nd through the 25th, 1983, the World Health Organization convenes the first meeting to assess the worldwide AIDS situation and to encourage collaboration between different affected countries. So this is pretty important, where it starts becoming a global issue that like the world is starting to pay attention to, instead of just an issue that the US is paying attention to.
I would say yes. The United States had a problem. They really weren't even cooperating with the French all that much, right? Even with what we brought up earlier regarding the retrovirus discovery in France. There was still a lot of controversy over that. Here, there were a lot of medical people who were saying, no, it's not a retrovirus. No, it's not this. No, it's not that. So for the World Health Organization to actually come together and create a situation where countries are going to cooperate with each other, knowing that this was going to be a global pandemic, was extremely important, I think. And it sort of pushes the United States in the right direction. because obviously they're members of the World Health Organization, and the United States is, and the U.S. had a presence there as well. So um, the political situation in the United States just dragged its feet so much, in spite of what the medical community was doing and trying to do. Yeah, it was extremely important to have that WHO gathering, but it didn't translate into political action in the United States on the part of the government. And the medical community, the CDC, the NIH, all of those agencies were working hard on it, as hard as they could with the limited resources they had. And of course, they are in fact funded by the political machinery. And unlike the rest of the world, like in places like France particularly, the government got behind that research very quickly. And initially, a lot of the real progress that was being made was coming out of France. So having this World Health Organization come together and indicate that there was a need for global cooperation in response, I think was really helpful for the US politicians to hear.
Yeah, that makes sense. Just looking at 1984, the big thing in 1984 was April 23rd. The US Department of Health and Human Services secretary announces that Dr. Robert Gallo and his colleagues at the National Institute have found the cause of AIDS, which is a retrovirus that they've labeled HTLV3. They also announced the development of a diagnostic blood test to identify it and to express hope for a vaccine against AIDS at some point, which they say was in the next 2 years they were hoping, but obviously did not play out that way.
No, there's still no vaccine. Even after all these years, they've never been able to come up with a vaccine.
Right.
There is a medical regimen, pharmaceutical regimen that can render you basically HIV negative. Even if you are positive, you aren't going to show it. You're not going to show. You can't transmit the disease because it's not evident. Okay, but it's not actually a vaccine.
Got it. Okay. All right. So we eventually get into like 85. March of 85, the FDA approves a test as the first commercially available test for detecting HIV in blood, and blood banks begin screening after this, which is a pretty crucial step in terms of all of this and in terms of identifying things. Right. Okay. So Saturn's at late Scorpio. We're dealing with the tail end of Saturn and Scorpio, and Pluto at the beginning of Scorpio. So this period is the final period of like fully defining what this is and identifying it and laying the foundation for a lot of the work that's done later. Not long after that, in 85, Larry Kramer's play, The Normal Heart, premieres and is really successful. I believe. Are you familiar with his work?
Yeah. I actually just saw the film version of it last week.
Okay.
Again, I had seen it a number of times before, but I watched it 2 weeks ago.
Got it. So focuses on the rise of HIV and AIDS in New York between 1981 and 1984. And then in November of 85, an early Frost, the first TV movie dealing with AIDS and gay relationships, was broadcast. So that's pretty crucial. In June of 85, we have Ryan White's formal request to be readmitted to school, which is denied, that we talked about earlier. And also that summer, Rock Hudson is the first major public figure who announces that he has AIDS.
Right. And he went to France for treatment. For whatever reason, at that point in time, I think most people believed that the French were further along than we were in treating the disease. And so they put him on a plane and he went to France for treatment.
Okay. So this is in July, and this is the tail end of Saturn and Scorpio. And then this kind of important event eventually starts happening right at the very tail end before Saturn departs from Scorpio, which is September 17th, 1985. Reagan finally mentions AIDS publicly in a press conference and calls it a top priority and defends his administration's response. And then shortly after that, on October 2nd, 1985, Congress allocates nearly 190 million for AIDS research. Yeah, and these two things happen basically right before Saturn leaves Scorpio in mid-November of 85.
Yes. And
So,
that was the, like I said, that was the first time that we heard from the Reagan administration.
right.
He'd never once mentioned it in 4 years. And so we heard it for the first time, and we heard it, and everybody was, of course, extremely happy. He was putting 190 million. That's still a drop in the bucket compared to what other countries were putting in, but it was it was an important step forward.
Yeah. So that they finally, because this is 4 years into it at this point, and now the head of the government is finally mentioning it at least and starting to allocate funds. One of the shifts that happens in late 85 is that Saturn goes into Sagittarius. And one of the things that I thought was notable is that by the end of the year, by December 19th, the United Nations states that at least one HIV case has been reported from each region of the world. So it's like Saturn is now in Sagittarius and the epidemic is fully international at this point.
Right.
And also at this point, it seems like over the next few years, during the course of Saturn and Sagittarius, a lot of international efforts surrounding AIDS really ramp up at this time.
Yeah, they do. But it also, the death toll mounts internationally. I mean, yes, initially it was just in the United States, and then it was in Europe, and then it hit Africa and Asia, and it really, once Saturn went to Sagittarius, then the death toll really started mounting globally, and then, because there was still no treatment for it.
Right. So I found some different graphs, but here's one of them, for example, that just shows the numbers in the early 1980s and just how it just shoots up
Right.
at different points. And here's another graph, but this one starts in 1990, but it gives you some idea at least of the number of deaths from HIV/AIDS, annual numbers of deaths, and it is just continually shooting up through the 90s until it eventually peaks later in the 90s and early 2000s and begins to decline.
Yeah. Well, and that's because we actually had a medical regimen after that worked. I mean, those were the Bush years, and he put a massive amount of money into the research and into the pharmaceuticals to make something happen, more than had been happening. And then, like I said, a lot of the drop in loss of life has everything to do with sharing what the United States developed in his administration with the rest of the world for nothing. I mean, just handing it over. In Africa, he just turned all of that over and provided massive amounts of the medications that were coming out of the pharmaceuticals here in the United States. And he was paying for it. He didn't charge them. It was a free thing to stop the spread of AIDS. And it worked. He saved millions of lives.
Yeah, there was some like really major, and there's a major turning point at the Saturn-Pluto opposition that I want to get to. I did want to mention, you had mentioned ACT UP a few times, and you do have a chart for that you gave me. It was founded on March 12th, 1987 at around 7:30 p.m.
Yeah, well, the meeting started at 7:30 p.m. Yeah.
And this chart is set for Larry Kramer giving like a talk, right?
Right. Well, yes, Larry Kramer was an active member of ACT UP. He was part of the initial impetus for it. I think it was Larry Kramer who actually called for it to be organized.
Yeah, that's my understanding of what this is.
I think it was in Larry Kramer's apartment in New York.
Right. So, and I'll have you describe it, but one of the things I think that's really important about this chart is we've now shifted to Saturn in Sagittarius, but we're very close to the Saturn-Uranus conjunction in Sagittarius at this point, where Saturn's at 20 degrees of Sag and Uranus is at 26 Sag. And I think that's one of the signatures for ACT UP.
It
Was
is,
it
yes.
so could you describe what ACT UP was?
ACT was an organization to force the country, and particularly the politicians, both locally and nationally, in DC, force them to confront the realities of the loss of life, death in the gay community, and that it was spreading. And there was still very little being done. Yes, in 85, Reagan said, there's AIDS, it's the priority, 190 million. It didn't do enough. It was not nearly enough. ACT UP was demanding full mobilization of governmental resources to stop the spread of AIDS. Research, medication, hopefully vaccination, whatever it was going to take. And they were going to do it with direct confrontation. And so it wasn't just demonstrations. They would stop traffic. They would get in politicians' faces. They would plaster the silence equal death all over everything. It was an act of civil rebellion, what ACT UP was doing, but they were very effective. It was stunning how effective they really were in getting the attention of the politicians in Congress, particularly.
Yeah, it seems like they organized a lot of protests, and it was very like aggressive and kind of like in your face, but it ended up being very effective actually in actually getting tangible change in different ways. Like one of the things that they protested was that one of the main early medicines for AIDS had this like astounding $10,000 a year price tag for it or something.
Yes.
And it was, I think at the time, it was the most expensive medicine that had ever been on the market.
And most
So,
people, 90%, 99% of any gay man who has HIV could not afford that medicine. It was impossible.
and that was AZT, right?
Hmm?
That was AZT. AZT, is that what it was?
AZT, yeah, AZT. Yes.
So it was originally like $10,000. And one of the things that ACT UP protested was that, and they were able to get the company or to force the company to do a price reduction from like 10,000 to 7,000, I think is what I read.
Yeah, that was significant. It was still, I mean, if you didn't have insurance, you weren't going to be able to afford it. Insurance companies were loath to pay for it. It took a tremendous amount of activism and pushing, and even, and finally certain Congress people actually got behind it and began pushing also for a reduction in cost, and at least to get insurance companies to cover it.
Okay. So yeah, so that ended up being really effective. They organized a lot of protests and different types of sit-ins and other things like that from when they were founded in 87. It seemed like all the way through like 91 or so in some of the major events, like lists that I was looking at, which is really interesting because it coincided with the entire period of Saturn being with conjoining Uranus in Sagittarius, but also both planets moved into Capricorns. The conjunction continued into the late 80s and early 90s.
Yes. And when they were in Capricorn, I think is when ACT UP had its most success. The work they had been doing actually turned out to lay the groundwork for what happened then in the early 90s with there was less stigma attached. I mean, it was easier to come out. It was very important that one of the things that ACT UP did was push the coming out process. They wanted, a couple of times, a few of the ACT UP people, I think, overstepped, and they would out certain people that they wanted to be out, and they wouldn't do that voluntarily. So they sort of did it for them. That's an unfortunate thing, but it did kind of, I think, scare a lot of prominent people who were gay and not out, that they would be outed. So many of them started coming out, and and like I said, then we had a national coming out day, and then people were just coming out left and right, and it was very important that was part of the process.
Okay, so that was part of the diet, and that's part of what you were talking about earlier that you said eventually motivated you and maybe some other astrologers in the community too.
Yeah, yeah, and particularly in Seattle, it was Bruce Hammerslaw and I who talked about that, and the idea of because Bruce had not come out yet within the astrological community, even though I had been trying to do that since '83 and telling people that I was gay. It didn't seem to go anywhere. I mean, it's like people ignored it, kind of. They just, oh, okay, whatever. And it really wasn't until Bruce then said something in the late '80s at the NORWAC that people in Seattle began to perk up their ears and say, "Oh, we have gay people in the community, and some of them are HIV positive, some have AIDS." That was an extremely important step, I think, and that had everything to do with ACT UP. And it had everything to do with, was a Saturn, Uranus, and Capricorn.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it's interesting because, just over the past few years, we had the Saturn-Uranus square as Saturn has been transiting through Aquarius and squaring Uranus and Taurus. And we saw a lot of protests over the course of the past few years about different things. And there was kind of a similar energy of, standing up to establishments or like the government, especially, and trying to like shake up change and make change happen, sometimes against what was seen as like a oppressive or like intractable sort of authority figures.
Yeah. And I think that's common with, that's very common with Saturn Uranus. Of course, we have to understand too that Saturn Uranus had everything to do with the collapse symbolically. I mean, if you want, just the way you were describing it, the collapse of the Berlin Wall. So that there is that Uranus Saturn thing where the Uranus comes in and just brings down the walls, so
demolishes everything. Right.
Doesn't it, but not in a bad way. I don't think that Uranus demolishes the good things about Saturn. I think what it does is it tears down what isn't appropriate in the way that Saturn is applied socially. If it's too oppressive, if it's if it's too oppressive, Uranus is going to break through that somehow, and it usually takes demonstrations and protest against those sort of tyrannical Saturnian policies.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so by 1991 and 1992, Saturn is in Aquarius, and it's squaring Pluto in mid Scorpio at this point. And like I said earlier, it's like we continue to see, in some instances, like major celebrities talking about, being HIV positive, like Magic Johnson, for example. The basketball star comes out with that on November 7th, 1991. And I think that's an important or one of many notable, instances of that. But also just that in 1991 and 1992, I think what's important is that we hit the waxing square or the opening square of the Saturn-Pluto synodic cycle. And at this point in the chronologies, AIDS becomes the #1 cause of death for US men between the ages of 25 to 44. So that's pretty major at this time, or that's a really important turning point.
Well, it's a crisis in action. I mean, let's say for what happened at the conjunction, when we look at what happened at the conjunction and the disease sort of takes hold, and we become aware of that disease and what it is and how it develops. And now at the square, you see an increasing number of deaths, like you were saying. So you're in a inner crisis mode when it hits that square, but also in terms of, let's say, public reaction. What happened at the 45 degree, what happened at the 60 degree relation angle or aspect between Saturn and Pluto. Now you get to the square and you realize there was progress made in getting the public to get behind ending the epidemic. And not just that, but business and pharmaceuticals and government. And by the early 90s at the square, of course you had Clinton, who was elected, and he's even pushing, opening up the military to gay men. And of course, it doesn't work out that way. We end up with this horrendous compromise called "Don't Ask, Don't Tell." But nonetheless, gay men were now openly in the military. And so there's a lot of stuff that's happening with the Saturn-Pluto thing in relation to the disease, but the disease in turn is having, and what we're doing with the disease and how we're reacting to it socially is having an impact on how the country actually views gay people and where their place is in society, and how they're, and the coming out process is really all about, we are here, we're not going away, and we want to be part of the fabric of American society. And so at the square, this political push behind AIDS really gets some momentum going. And the conservatives lost out on that one. They pushed hard against it, but in the end, those whose intentions were at the conjunction to do something about the disease and to do something about the conditions of gay men, particularly in American society, that really took on at the first quarter square a crisis in action where the gay community and the human rights campaign, they were able to make some really positive advancements in politically in the country.
Yeah, I noticed in like 1993, as soon as Clinton gets in office in 92, that he establishes the White House Office of National AIDS Policy. So it seems like with that shift, that there's a little bit more political effort and like movement from that point forward. And I know, for example, there was one doctor, for example, who in 1992, on September 14th, 1992, he was doing like a biopsy or an autopsy on a patient who had died of AIDS, and he accidentally cut himself and ended up getting AIDS as a result of that. But then he sort of set about looking at a lot of the scientific research that was available and started combining different drugs, which ended up being like an early version of some of the later like AIDS cocktails that would later be successful in the future, later in the 90s. So it seems like there were things that were happening at that point where some of the understanding of how to start putting together different antiviral drugs or other drugs that would later become what would be successful, that started to germinate.
Yeah. And the first quarter square, you can expect that kind of thing. It is a crisis in action, and sometimes, depending on what happened at the semi-square and at the sextile and at the quintile, and even at the septile, is going to determine what happens at the first quarter square. And because of the positive developments in relation to the gay community and AIDS in that first quarter, throughout the first quarter of the Saturn-Pluto cycle, at the square, that crisis in action actually became a mobilization of energy and political force, and from the government itself, not just in the grassroots. So that was a really positive thing that, when we move forward, look at the trine, and then look at the 135-degree aspect, and then look at the opposition, the Saturn-Pluto opposition, and you'll see where those things that actually came into being and those things that got political traction at the first quarter square come to fruition at the opposition.
Yeah, I was really struck by in 1995 and 1996, we have Saturn in Pisces and it's trining Pluto. And Pluto also eventually ingresses into Sagittarius so that it sort of continues the sign-based square with Saturn.
Mm-hmm.
And what we see at this time is the first protease inhibitor drugs are approved by the FDA in December of 1995 through 96. And then after this, from like 1996 forward, the number of new AIDS case diagnoses in the US declines for the first time since the beginning of the epidemic in 1996. And then eventually, not long after that, AIDS is no longer the leading cause of death for all Americans aged 25 to 44, although it still remains a leading cause of death for African Americans in this age group.
Yeah.
So yeah, we see a turning point. Then eventually, I think we get to the opposition around 2000, 2001, where Pluto's in Sagittarius and Saturn goes into Gemini.
Right. And that's when we start seeing the distribution of, well, that's where we start seeing government taking full-scale responsibility. Okay. Yeah, it started at the first quarter square, and even in terms of pharmaceuticals participating in the efforts to get this medication out there. At the opposition, starting in the early 2000s, you start seeing, like I said, President Bush actually spending tremendous amounts of billions of dollars in AIDS research and funding, and both in terms of pharmaceuticals and then using some of that money as well to ship these products to other parts of the world for free.
Yeah, it seems like from 2000 forward that the international efforts to combat AIDS really ramp up when the Saturn-Pluto opposition gets going, and more formalized agreements to start to address disparities between the resources for AIDS in different countries and regions of the world really becomes the focus.
Yeah.
Let's see, I've got on my timeline, July 2002, Joint United Nations Program on AIDS reports that HIV/AIDS is now by far the leading cause of death in sub-Saharan Africa and the fourth biggest global killer. The average life expectancy in sub-Saharan Africa falls from 62 years to 47 as a result of AIDS. And this is all during the Saturn-Pluto opposition from Gemini to Sagittarius.
Yeah.
So that's a really important and striking turning point, even if in the US, some of it's starting to decline. Worldwide, we're still
Well, sure,
it's getting worse.
We're still in this cycle of increasing loss of life all through the first, the waning cycle from conjunction to opposition. You are going to get increased loss of life. I think that's a given in the Saturn-Pluto cycle. It's after the opposition, and when it comes down to the waning side, that you start seeing, if all the measures that have been put into place and the political traction is there, and they're successful at the opposition, then after the opposition, as it goes into its waning phase, then you're going to see the numbers drop in terms of death, and you're going to see more cooperation as it goes through the disseminating phase, where there's the cooperation between countries is going to spread out, and they're going to do more to combat this, and there's more resources going to be put into it. That's just the nature of the cycle as you go through the disseminating phase after the full phase.
Yeah, for sure. And in 2003, when the Saturn Pluto opposition is on its way out. On the tail end of that, we get oral arguments are being made at March 26, 2003 in the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court would eventually, a few months later in June of 2003, strike down the quote unquote like homosexual conduct law, which decriminalizes same-sex conduct.
Right.
With their
That
opinion.
June, that's at the end of June 24th or June 26th. I can't remember the date, but
26th.
June 26th. Yeah. And the decision comes down at just a minute or two after 10 a.m.
Oh, you have a chart for that?
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
It's about 10:02. I think it's about 10:02 in the morning on the 6th, on the 26th.
In like Washington?
Washington, D.C. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So here it is. Okay, there it is. That's kind of, so that's an exact time, 10:02 a.m.
Yeah, it is.
Huh, that's really interesting. Okay, so we've got 26 Leo rising and Jupiter's at 17 Leo. That's really striking because it's just reminding me of the 2015 court decision where Venus and Jupiter were meeting up around those degrees in Leo, I think.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the decision then came down within a minute or two after 10 a.m. in 2015.
Okay. So, and this was important because basically up until this point, some of those state laws still basically banned same-sex relationships.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there a lot of states. I mean, and probably a good half of the country, states still criminalized same-sex behavior. Illinois was the first to decriminalize in 1961. Other states, most states that did decriminalize did so in the 1970s, between 73 and 75 mostly.
Okay.
The rest of them still insisted that they, his same-sex behavior was illegal in those states, and not just illegal, but it was criminal. And a lot of those states still had the same laws on the books that were created, by 1923, 10 years in prison. And, if you were considered incorrigible, then you were going to be sterilized.
Wow.
So it was great that Lawrence v. Texas struck down those laws, saying those are unconstitutional.
Yeah, that's a huge turning point. So jumping forward a little bit, by late 2009, 2008 and 2009, we get Saturn goes into Libra and it's squaring Pluto, which is in early Capricorn. So we get the waning square and the last major phase of the hard aspects of the Saturn-Pluto cycle. And over the next few years, while Saturn is transiting through Libra and squaring Pluto in Capricorn, we get some major developments. In October 30th of 2009, the Obama administration announces that they will officially lift the HIV travel and immigration ban in January of 2010, which is really huge because basically, going back to the early part of the epidemic, they outlawed travel basically of people who were HIV positive to travel into the US or to immigrate here.
Yeah. And I think I consider the last quarter phase sort of a crisis in awareness, perhaps crisis in consciousness, where it begins a time where you're 3/4 of the way through the cycle, but you now have perspective on what happened, everything that went right and everything that went wrong through the cycle from the previous conjunction. And it's a time to adjust and make corrections, and also to make sure that you keep the effort going. A lot of times, because it is a crisis in awareness and a crisis consciousness, there's often, I've seen historically with certain planetary pairs, outer planetary pairs like this, that they lose momentum at the last quarter square. And then that opens the door for opposition to come in and try to establish a foothold in the process, so that when the next conjunction comes along, that opposition takes control. In this case, that's not what happened. We were able to, I think, correctly see what went right, what went wrong through the cycle. And energy was mobilized. We kept things going, both in terms of medical research, in terms of cooperation globally, in terms of getting things right politically inside the United States as well. And not just here, but in Europe, they did the same thing. So we started seeing some really positive developments in the AIDS thing.
Yeah, this is a really crucial and largely positive turning point, this waning square around 2010 and 2011. Some of the stuff in my chronology is just Obama signs the Affordable Care Act, March 23rd, 2010. And this actually, one of the side effects that some people don't know about the Affordable Care Act is that it expanded access to care and prevention for all Americans, but in particular, it offered special protections to those living with chronic illnesses like HIV that made it difficult for them to access or afford healthcare prior to that time. So like pre-existing conditions and things like that.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, I knew men who were HIV positive and could not get insurance prior to Obamacare. Luckily, those men did not become sick with AIDS, the ones I knew, but if they had, it would have been a nightmare for them. You know, I mean, the cost of the medicines and the cost of hospitalization that can happen, even if you go in and then come out and you're okay for a while. The medical expenses are just outrageous. So for them to be covered under the Obamacare Act was a major step forward. And it also gave people with HIV hope that, they're going to get through this. Yeah, it was great.
That makes sense. So here's the chart for that, March 23rd, 2010. We see Saturn is at 1 degree of Libra. It's squaring Pluto at 5 Capricorn. It's opposite the sun at 2 Aries. And at some point that day, the moon swooped in and completed a grand cross at somewhere in early Cancer, like 4 Cancer. So later that year, there was other things. In July, the Obama administration released the first comprehensive national HIV/AIDS strategy for the United States on July 13th, 2010. November of 2010, a huge development was the National Institutes of Health announced the results of a study showing that a daily dose of HIV drugs reduced the risk of HIV infection among HIV-negative men who had sex with other men by 44%, supporting the concept of pre-exposure prophylaxis in a targeted population. So basically what ended up happening is that PrEP was developed at the Saturn-Pluto square as well.
Yes.
And eventually by July of 2012, when Saturn is still in Libra squaring Pluto, PrEP is approved by the FDA. So that's huge. And it just shows that's like the final thing for me where I was like, okay, yes, this is, we can see the foundation of this epidemic, at the Saturn-Pluto conjunction in the early 80s. And then we see the important turning points especially the hard aspects during the course of it.
Yes.
And that was one of the final really major ones, was developing some of the things that could help people if they felt like they had been exposed to not develop HIV, even if they had been exposed.
Right. And not just that, I mean, yes, PrEP is there, but that's one part of the overall pharmaceutical regimen that's available. And it's quite astonishing to me that you can watch TV and you will see commercials for these medicines for HIV positive people. And with the message that you may be HIV, but we promise you will never get AIDS. You have a medical regimen that makes this disease manageable, for who knows how long. That is just mind-blowing to me, that we can watch these commercials on TV that actually advertise this reality. I mean, perhaps young people don't maybe have the historical perspective, and so it's just like, oh, well, that's cool. Yeah, right. coming from where I'm coming from 1981 until now, this is just phenomenal.
Yeah. Yeah. From going from of it literally being a death sentence in the early to mid 1980s or even early 90s
Yeah.
of people being given months to live or a few years to live or what have you to living for decades and living out a full healthy life with it becoming something that's manageable.
Yeah. And that includes having an active sex life. I mean, you don't have to be afraid of that anymore.
Mhm.
It's a wonderful thing. I mean, and that shows you in the cycle, the Saturn-Pluto cycle from beginning to the next one, that, okay, now we're off and we're doing something else again with the last Saturn-Pluto conjunction. AIDS is still a reality out there, but like I said, it's no longer a crisis. It is a manageable disease. And that is everything that we wanted from the beginning. Just let's make it manageable in some way, either a vaccine or somehow make it so that it doesn't destroy our lives. And that's been done. And yeah, I agree with you. You can watch these aspects, these key turning points. And you're right, especially at the first quarter square opposition, last quarter square, and how these developments actually happened. And that one at each turn, what happened was absolutely dependent on what happened at the previous aspect. So this is my message with the planetary pairs, no matter what it is, that you do have an 8-phase cycle, just like you do with the sun moon. It's the same concept. It's the same thing. And you do have an interpretive framework for that. Okay. For the new phase and the crescent phase and the first quarter phase, et cetera, all the way around to the last phase, the balsamic phase, and what those phases mean and how to interpret the aspects within those phases. I think a lot of times we get stuck with the idea that an aspect, a trine is a trine is a trine. It doesn't matter, where the two planets are in relation to each other, they're trined. That's not the case if we want to really look at that from a mundane point of view, going from in a developmental cycle from conjunction to opposition back to conjunction. Then the waning phase aspects have taken on a very different meaning than the waxing phase aspects. So the first quarter trine as a waxing trine, and then the last quarter trine as a waning, they have very different meanings and very different social and political realities that follow.
Yeah, that's huge. It really depends on where you're at in the cycle, and is it something that's still building up in the same way that the moon, when it's in the waxing part of its phase, is still increasing in light and getting brighter and brighter, heading towards the full moon at the opposition? Or are you on the waning side of the phase of the relationship, where in the lunar cycle the moon has passed the full moon point and is now getting dimmer and dimmer and dimmer until it eventually completes the cycle at the new moon, at the next new moon?
Yeah. But I think the difference is with when you're using something, we're using that model with, say, Saturn-Pluto or Uranus-Pluto, whatever. But when we get to that balsamic phase, the last 45 degree before the conjunction again, that is the most, historically, and in my work, it's very clear to me that any two of the outer planets, when they reach that balsamic phase, that is really the crisis time. That's the end of the cycle. Everything starts breaking down. And reality is up for grabs in regards to the two planets involved. And there's a tremendous struggle for dominance to determine what new intentions will be set at the conjunction. So politically, those are very volatile times when the two outer planets are in a 45 degree angle, but in the balsamic phase, in the waning part of the cycle.
Yeah, that makes sense. Let me see if I can show your graphic again from your blog, where you have that full cycle with all of the major and minor aspects?
Well, just the 45, 60 trines, and 135 and trines.
Got it.
I didn't
Okay.
include the septile or the quintile,
Got
right?
it. Yeah.
Aspects in it, but I do pay very close attention to them. They are part of my interpretive framework with that. So,
Yeah. All right. And then here's just some graphs from Wikipedia that gives some perspective on this on their page for HIV AIDS. And then it has a diagram labeled trends in new cases and deaths per year from HIV AIDS. And you just see the numbers going up and up and up in the 90s. And then eventually in the early 2000s, around the time of the opposition between Saturn and Pluto, it finally starts to decline worldwide until where it's at today.
yeah.
So yeah, that's pretty striking. It shows also that, because this cycle that we've talked about with the new moon or the conjunction between those two outer planets, and then the waxing square and the opposition, the waning square, we're used to doing that because you can usually apply that to outer planet cycles in a person's birth chart. Like the Saturn cycle, for example, is commonly used, and you can apply those principles to a person's life in those 30-year increments of the Saturn cycle. But it just shows that some of these principles are just as applicable, not just in natal astrology, but also to mundane astrology. You're just dealing with a much broader timeframes and much broader scales sometimes when you're working at that level.
Right. And you're working with historical and sociopolitical processes, right? In that sense, the interpretation of the different phases and the aspects within the phases take on a different hue. They're a little different than when you're watching the human development of an individual person. But the principle, like you said, is the same. And you can do that with any two planets. And watching, particularly, I would say particularly your sun moon, your progressed lunation cycle, for example, in your secondary progressions, I think that's critical to see. The new phase, the progressed new moon, progress first quarter square, and opposition, and so forth. They tell you a lot about a person's journey during that 28, 30-year period.
Yeah, for sure. All right, here's some other graphs I want to show just before we wrap up. So this is Archetypal Explorer again, just showing the original conjunction in the early 80s between Saturn and Pluto, the first square in the early to mid 90s, the opposition in the early 2000s, and then the waning square from 2010 and 2011, around that time frame.
Right.
And then finally the next conjunction in the end of that cycle in 2020.
Right.
So that's cool. And then also another graph for worldwide deaths, just showing the peak in the early 2000s and then the decline. That's the other thing that's, I think, interesting, and that got me fascinated with this in 2020 when we were dealing with COVID, is that it's kind of rare with astrology sometimes when you're dealing with life events or you're dealing with people's psychology. Sometimes you don't have a lot of like objective data to work with, except for like, a marriage date or somebody like gets a job or something like that. But with this, studying pandemics, it's kind of interesting as an astrologer, as a mundane astrologer, because you have some objective data to work with to sort of compare some of the, not just the charts, but the different planetary cycles over long spans of time. And I think there's something that's fascinating from that, just with my astrologer cap on, aside from the personal, obviously, and the human side of that story. There's just it's much different than how we're used to applying astrology in some ways.
Absolutely. I mean, I love that. I watch the outer planetary cycles and I compare them to different times in history. I mean, given what's happening now, let's take Uranus-Pluto, for example. I mean, we just, not too long ago, a few years ago, had the Uranus-Pluto first quarter square after their conjunction in 1965, 66. And we know from that conjunction that we had a great liberalization in the world, not just in the United States, I mean, in Europe as well. There was this big flowering of liberal political and social philosophy. And out of that, of course, you get civil rights and voting rights and women's rights and gay rights. And all of this comes in the wake of that Uranus-Pluto conjunction, 65, 66. Now, when we hit that first quarter square, we got a dose of reality in a big way with a conservative backlash to that liberalization and their efforts to undo that. Okay, and now as we approach the trine, okay, and we're starting to see some success that they're having in undoing some of the liberal principles and policies of the mid 1960s and 70s. But there's a parallel to that. All we have to do is look at the last time Uranus and Pluto were in the same relationship, first quarter square, 1876. From there to the opposition in 1901, we saw exactly the same thing. A packed court with racists and conservatives who overturned in 1883 every single civil rights law that was passed after the Civil War. And then by 1896, they had completely, with the Plessy decision, they completely segregated the country, not just racially, but ethnically. So, and then by 1901 at the opposition, it was a done deal. And not only was it a completely segregated society racially and ethnically, but the federal government actually then created policies around things like redlining in real estate practices and that sort of thing. So we're in a parallel situation right now. The liberals didn't fight hard enough back then to stop that. Hopefully, we'll be able to stand up to this and this challenge to the great liberalization of the Uranus-Pluto conjunction of 65, 66 as we go through this first quarter square between the two planets now. We're in that parallel period in the late 19th century where Uranus and Pluto are in the same relationship.
Sure. So this is what you do, and this is a large part of your specialization, is studying these types of outer planet cycles and always looking at it relative to, what started under a conjunction, and then what context does that set then for the next aspects?
Exactly. And then I compare what I'm looking at to historical cycles to make sure that I'm on the right track, because if nothing else, astrology is predictable when it comes to these patterns. You see these patterns repeat, and you look at the social political processes that are going on, and you realize, well, it's really no different. I mean, we're just in a different, we're in a different time in history, and so yeah, you have different technologies and different political systems, but some of the same things are happening in regard to the same principles. And particularly with Uranus Pluto, it has everything to do with civil rights. It has everything to do with human rights. It has everything to do with a reaction to that in the form of bigotry and discrimination, and how that plays out in the society, and who's going to win and who's going to come out on top and who's going to control the social, political, and cultural narrative. That is what Uranus Pluto is all about. So, I mean, that's just an example of how I look at these cycles, and I call it astrohistory, more than just astrology or more than just mundane astrology, because everything about it is rooted in history. It's always looking back to the 2 or 3 previous cycles to figure out what this next one that's coming is going to do. And it's pretty easy to do that. I mean, you just look at the sign that they fall in, and maybe even the decan. I do look at the decanates as well to get some underlying information. But it's to me, it's really important work to do. Yeah, a lot of my writing about this stuff is in my blog. I have a number of articles related to the Jupiter-Saturn cycle, the last Jupiter-Neptune cycle, the Uranus-Pluto cycle. I have a number of articles related to these things.
Okay, and your website
based on the research that just
GaryLorentzen.com.
GaryLorentzen.com. Yeah, Gary Lorentzen, all one word, GaryLorentzen.com.
Brilliant. There it is. There's your blog. Yeah, and to your point, I mean, I think one thing though that makes a difference is actually living through and experiencing events as they're happening and observing the planets and what they're doing at that time does something different to you that I've had to learn as a younger astrologer as I get older and I have that experience over and over again. You internalize it in a much different way, I think,
Yeah,
than
you do.
somebody that just goes back and researches it in books or events that they didn't experience at the time. Where, for example, living through the early 1980s and having that firsthand experience of the AIDS epidemic when 2020, was coming along, let's say in 2019, and people were wondering what that Saturn-Pluto conjunction was going to be like.
Yeah.
You had a pretty good idea and a pretty good experience from before to draw
Right.
on of what that might be like or what the experience might be.
Right. And that's right. I mean, yeah, personal experience with it as you get older, you are going to experience these cycles, right?
Mhm.
And so if you have any memory at all, you're going to have, it's going to be part of your consciousness as these conjunctions and oppositions squares happen as they do. I feel like my job is, however, sure, I pay attention to those. And yeah, I have a personal reaction to all of those and I have personal memories around them. But having been a student of history for going on 50 years, and actually university study and all of that, the history to me is paramount. We don't understand these outer planetary cycles without looking at the historical realities of them. It's just like our personal, like you were saying, you have this personal experience in, let's say, in 82. And so you have this sort of intuition or some sort of indication of what the next, say, Saturn-Pluto conjunction is going to bring, because you had that experience. If you study history and you actually go back and research that stuff, the cycles that happened in previous centuries, and look at the history around them, I think that's my job to write about. That's my passion. That's what I love to write about. There's painfully little. I mean, sure, Tarnas does this just mind-blowing thing with his books, and I love them. I mean, they're just such top-notch, just such quality astrological thinking as well as intellectual work.
Cosmos and Psyche, I guess I should mention the title.
Yeah, Cosmos and Psyche.
That's like a book that everybody who does this kind of historical research, that's one of their top, if not their top book.
Absolutely, for me, yeah. But also Passion of the Western Mind. He lays the groundwork for Cosmos and Psyche in the first book, Passion of the Western Mind. But that's pure history. And yet, for those of us who do think of themselves as historians, when I read through Passion of the Western Mind, I understood exactly what he was doing and where he was going. And I knew at the end of that book that he was going to come up with something like Cosmos and Psyche, where he was going to actually show the astrological implications of what he was writing about. And he did that. And then for me, I'm not that kind of a writer. I write in smaller chunks. My Mercury Saturn conjunct in Virgo, it's just, let's be precise here. Let's just get down to the nitty gritty and make it as short as possible, even though I get very verbose sometimes. And even my writing, like that article, is 10,000 words long, but still I could expand on that and turn that into a 300-page book easily. Right. So, and that's what I'm saying. It's just like I kind of hone it down to writing in smaller chunks about this stuff, mainly because I think it's a lot more accessible to the reader, where they don't have to go through 300-400 pages. And it wouldn't be a problem for me, but I talk to astrologers and they'll say, yeah, I didn't get through Cosmos and Psyche. It's just too big. I've met people who said that. The same thing with other, with Rudyard's books or with Markin and Jones. and they especially, most people just can't deal with Mark Goodman Jones. So at some point, we have to take some of these ideas that these, I would say, very intellectual astrologers have, and try to put them into smaller chunks and more manageable and more consumable. And I hope that's what I'm doing.
Yeah. No, I think people will find a lot of really valuable resources in terms of that on your blog. And I like your point that, a good astrologer, especially a mundane astrologer, is a student of history,
Right.
and that there's something very valuable about learning the tools of the historian in order to combine that with astrology, because once you do, you learn a lot about astrology, as we've demonstrated in this episode, with a lot of really striking correlations. If you just go back and start studying what happened in the past, you learn a lot of things that are then relevant that you can project out into the future. Like if you were to project that, for example, in 2020, the way that many astrologers did, and correctly predict with, pretty striking accuracy, what's coming up. But also sometimes you can take some of these things and project them back into the future and use them for historical research.
Yes.
You mentioned going back and studying past conjunctions, and that's actually one of the things that kept coming up for me over and over again as I was researching this, is researching some of the early history of AIDS, because it didn't start in 1981. It's just that we became aware of it and the pandemic really got going at that point. But scientific researchers currently think that AIDS originally jumped from, I think, chimpanzees into humans sometime around the 1910 through 1920 time frame.
Very early on.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting about that to me is that 1910 to 1920 time frame is right in the middle of that, as we talked about earlier.
Right.
Is another
Saturn-Pluto conjunction.
Yeah, a Saturn-Pluto conjunction in Cancer in between the 1913 through 1916 or 17 time frame, which then, from an astrological standpoint, if we've kind of established already that the Saturn-Pluto cycle was relevant to the AIDS epidemic from the 1980s through the 2020s, it could be suggestive then that the astrology could be pointing us and sort of telling us where the earlier history of this may have started, right there around the 1914, 1915 time frame, which also is interesting because it's just another, if that's true, let's just say hypothetically for a moment, it's just another one of those implications or indications of something we've seen a few times, that sometimes the astrology is telling you that something important is happening, but at the time you may not fully understand or know what has happened that's so important that started at that time. And sometimes it's important things are happening and the astrology is kind of yelling at you that something's happening, but you may not be aware of it until later in retrospect.
I call that it's a perpetual condition of what do I want to say? Failure of imagination. I mean, we see it, but we can't imagine that it's actually going to happen that way, and yet it so often does. I'm guilty of that too. I can think back to November of 2019 and thinking, well, I know it brings epidemics, but do we really think we're going to get a global pandemic out of this thing? Some people are saying, yes, I really do think that. And I was having a failure of imagination at that time. And it wasn't until the end of December that I really changed my mind about the COVID pandemic. But initially it was no, I don't want to believe that that's going to happen. You know what I mean? I had that failure of imagination in November. And I think that's a common thing among astrologers.
Yes. Yeah. Sometimes that's a lesson I've had to learn as well, that you have to just call it like you see it. And there's something valuable about that. And sometimes also that sometimes the most literal manifestation of the basic keywords that you have for those planets or those combinations can oftentimes hit the closest to what the actual manifestation is.
Yes.
And while it's true that it's also, especially in natal astrology, that sometimes there's broader psychological things that are not quite as literal, especially when dealing with mundane astrology, sometimes it's just very literal and very straightforward in terms of the
Mhm.
symbolism.
Mhm. I would agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
It makes, to me, that's what made mundane astrology that much more fascinating and a little more cut and dry. It fit my Mercury, Saturn, and Virgo better than dealing with people. I got to the point that I just said, I can't deal with people anymore. I can't sit down and carry the burden of their lives, you know.
Yeah, well, it just shows there's different applications of astrology and different ways to use astrology to enhance other types of studies. And it's not all just like one thing. There's many different ways to be an astrologer. And I think this is
Right.
something, that I hope other historians at some point will find like what a useful tool astrology can be,
Right.
not replacing other historical studies, but as like an adjunct to enhance certain things.
Except that having been through that academic training in history, there's this absolute taboo rejection of what they call historicism. Now, historicism originally is associated with religious prophecy, okay? But anything that, like astrology, for example, that says there are patterns that repeat and that the future can be predicted to some degree, right? Um, Historians reject that as unscientific. I've had that conversation with a number of professors because I would even try to write some of my papers back in at university in talking about historical patterns, not necessarily repetitive patterns, but patterns that resonate over time. And even that, the professor said, no, can't do that. You're not going to talk about stuff like that. So there is this fairly rigid position that most academic historians take, that they're just not interested in what they call historicism.
Yeah, and I could almost see, I could understand that, if you didn't have astrology as a framework, because occasionally it's like in history you see some of those patterns, but you don't see a clear mechanism or reason for some of those repetitions to exist. So it's easier to just chalk it up to a random pattern,
Right.
like,
Yeah.
people see like Jesus on a piece of toast or something like that.
Right.
But once you are aware of the astrology and you have enough training in the astrology to know what to look for, you can see some of those patterns underlying history. And some of them are just so striking that it's hard once you've seen it to, forget
Ignore
that
it
that
again.
exists. Yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't ignore it. And once I saw it, it was like, I can't ignore this. I
Yeah.
mean, the history professors say don't do it, but I'm going to say I'm doing it. I can't not do it. I've seen it. I see what it is. And I'm going to go forward with it. But that also is why I didn't then go to grad school in history. I chose to do it in language and linguistics. But because of that resistance on the part of the historians.
Yeah, for sure. All right. So I want to say a few things to sort of wrap this or bring this to a close. One, I meant to say that we've only like scratched the surface of this topic. I'm sure there's other pieces that we missed or overlooked or didn't state with precision because this is such a huge and such a vast topic. I'm sure, this is only, even though this is like a 3-hour discussion, there was still a lot more that could have been said. And I hope that other people will use this as a starting point for further research and further work on this topic. And I'm sure there's a lot more to be done, both in terms of AIDS as well as in terms of the history of civil rights with the gay community and different things like that. So I want to say that. I wanted to say shout out to Lisa Scheim for helping with some research assistance for this episode. It was actually super invaluable. So I wanted to thank her for that. Shout out to Christopher Renstrom for that other article we mentioned that he wrote in the first Queer Astrologers publication. That was an amazing one that people should check out for additional information on some of this. I also think people should check out your article in volume 1 of the Ascendant Journal, the official journal for the Association for Young Astrologers, which Jen Zart edited, and she just told me last night that it's still available for purchase on Amazon. So it's just titled The Ascendant Volume 1, edited by Jennifer Zart, Austin Coppock, and Nicholas Civitello, back when Austin was still president of the Association for Young Astrologers. Your article in that is just amazing, and it was a very important contribution to understanding, the very personal impact that AIDS had on the astrological community. And so I really appreciate that you wrote that. And also there's probably a number of other astrologers that we don't know about, because I think you list like 14 in that article.
And I make it clear there may be more. These are the only ones I'm aware of, right?
Right.
How many more are out there? I don't know. And that's not counting probably some of the brilliant astrologers from Germany and England and,
Yeah, for sure. And just worldwide, that died or were affected by that pandemic. And then also, shout out to a lot of the younger astrologers then over the past decade that have sort of like picked up and taken the baton forward, especially many of the astrologers that organized or contributed to the Queer Astrology Conference and continue to. I know Dimitris Bagley, for example, has been continuing some of that work with the Queer Astrology Conference, and I believe their publication of papers is still available for sale if people want to pick up.
I think so.
Yeah, a copy of that. And you wrote the foreword to that, right?
Yeah.
Did you attend the first conference?
I attended the planning for it. I couldn't go to the first conference. I ended up, Jen called me. She was living in the Bay Area at the time. Jen Zart called me and said, Gary, come down. I want you to go to this meeting with me. And so Dan and I went down to visit Jen and stayed with her. And then she took me to this meeting, and it was Ian who was conducting the meeting. He was kind of in charge, and they were going over the idea of creating not just queering astrology, which is the overriding purpose, but then to actually create a conference, a queer astrology conference. And that was the year before the first conference actually took place. So what was that, 2012? It's been a long time.
Yeah, I think it was, well, the conference itself was July 2013. So yeah, that must have been 2012 that you're talking about.
It was the previous fall that I went to that planning session and participated in what Ian was doing there and also Rhea Wolf was there. And so I was part of that. And I introduced myself to Ian. And so we got to know each other, and it was from that. And I think it was also, Rhea Wolf actually is the one who contacted me and said, Gary, can you write the foreword to the conference transcripts?
Nice. Awesome. Yeah, she edited that and did a lot of work for that. I did check on Amazon, and it looks like it is available on Amazon. If people want to order the conference proceedings or the papers from that, just do a search for Queer Astrology Anthology, edited by Ian Waisler and Rhea Wolf. And like I said, I previously interviewed Ian about that on an early episode of the Astrology Podcast, episode 84, titled The Queer Astrology Conference. Awesome. Thank you so much for joining me for this today. This is amazing. This is great.
I had a great time. You're always fun to talk to, though, Chris. Whenever we talk, I really have a great time talking to you.
Thank you. The feeling is same. The feeling is mutual, and we'll have to do this again sometime for a different planetary combination to go over some other planetary cycles, because there's so many other ones that just echo throughout history.
Right. Many. So, but people can read what I've written about the last Jupiter-Neptune cycle, and I call it Jupiter-Neptune and the Deconstruction of Truth. That was one. There's a Saturn-Jupiter one that I wrote about, and then, like I said, and then the last one's about Uranus and Pluto.
Well, so your website's GaryLorentzen.com. And yeah, I see you have a bunch of articles. You've also got some audio lectures and stuff.
Right. Those I collected over the years by different astrologers, and I decided to put them on there. So.
Oh, wow. Okay. So some of these are actually some of the gay astrologers that you mentioned who passed away during the course of.
Exactly. So, like Buzz Myers is one, Howard Sesfortis.
Yeah. And I know we're wrapping up, but I meant to actually mention the dates of some of those people and some of the names that you mentioned, just to give people an idea of the scope. So for example, one of the names that you mentioned was Robert Cole, who passed away in 1992. Another one you mentioned is Jesse Portis Helm, who died in 1989. And these were all astrologers that died of AIDS.
Yeah.
Richard Lovell, 1993. Howard Sisportis, 1992. Tony Joseph, 1986. And you said he was the director of the NCGR in 1979?
No. NCGR, no, in 79. I don't know. I don't know if he was or not.
I thought that's what you said now. I was kind of surprised because that's a pretty high
maybe
position.
He might have been. He might have been, because he was part of that rebellion in 75 that led to the NCGR being founded. So he could have been. I don't remember anymore. That was a long time ago that I put that down there.
Let's see if I can pull it up. Hold on. So Joseph, here it is. You said Tony became director of the National Council for Geocosmic Research in 1979.
Okay. Then he did. Yeah.
Yeah, that's just crazy. It's became one of the main astrological organizations. So to have somebody who's basically the president or the lead of that organization, who was a gay man that would later die of AIDS less than a decade later, is pretty striking.
Yeah.
Another name was Stephen Wimerski, who you said passed away in 1993. And you noted that he was a stage manager of Michael Luton's play at UAC in 1992.
Yes.
And then your friend Bruce Hammerslaw, who passed away in 1995.
Yeah.
Buzz Myers in 2000. Mark Robertson in 1984, who you said on paper died of a heart attack, but
that was the official word, but we knew he was a gay man and we knew he was sick and had been. So the family, I think they're the ones that said he died of a heart attack, but no one really knows for sure. But knowing him, and he was one of my teachers, and talking to him, I had the feeling in the early 80s, before he died, that he looked like he had HIV. He had that appearance, and then he just kind of stopped. He disappeared for a while until they found him dead in his apartment.
Yeah, and I know there was other people or celebrities or instances, like with Liberace. I was reading about how his publicist said he died of a heart attack, but then after the autopsy, they said he died of AIDS-related complications.
Right.
And
that's finally what I think about Mark Robertson. That's
got it. And then finally, Richard Eidemann, who you mentioned, died in 1987. And it's like there's other astrologers who were who also passed away during that time that were gay, but may not have died of AIDS, like Jim Lewis.
Yeah, we just don't know. Yeah,
because he died of cancer in 1995, but he was only 53, and he was like one of the leading astrologers who developed astrocartography and locational astrology. But that's a really good instance of another one of those people that was pretty high up in the field who passed away much before their time. Yeah, so thanks for preserving some of those names and like passing on some of that history, and helping to connect this generation with that one. I think that's helped to reconnect things in a really good and productive way.
And I have to say, thanks to the late Miss Cunningham, who did that AIDS project, virtual quilt. A lot of that information, a lot of those names, I got from her quilt, okay, from her virtual quilt. So, okay. Donna Cunningham was one of the first astrologers to actually recognize that these gay men were out there and that they were getting sick and they were dying. And she made that public. And so shout out to the late Donna Cunningham.
Yeah, for sure. And then you also mentioned thanks to Aaron Sullivan and Alan Oken, who
I talked to them.
Helped you.
Yeah, I interviewed them. I asked them questions about gay astrologers they knew.
Um, yeah, but otherwise, I think, and then there's other astrologers that are never came out or that we may never know just because it's more of a private thing for different
Right.
astrologers for different
Right.
reasons.
Yeah, I'm sure there are other astrologers out there who died of AIDS, but we don't know that that's what happened. We just don't know.
Yeah, or other astrologers that were gay that didn't come out, but that lived through
Right.
the pandemic
Mhm.
and had similar experiences. Yeah. All right. I think that's it for this episode. Then thanks a lot for joining me for this.
Okay, thanks. We'll talk
All right.
again.
All
Bye.
right. Thanks everyone for watching or listening to this episode of the Astrology Podcast, and we'll see you again next time. Special thanks to all the patrons that helped to support the production of this episode of the podcast through our page on patreon.com. In particular, shout out to the patrons on our producers tier, including Thomas Miller, Catherine Conroy, Christy Moe, Ariana Amour, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Issa Sabah, Jake Otero, Mimi Stargazer, and Jean-Marie Kaplan. If you appreciate the work I'm doing here on the podcast and you'd like to find a way to support it, then please consider becoming a patron through our page on patreon.com. In exchange, you can get access to bonus content that's only available to patrons of the podcast, such as early access to new episodes, the ability to attend the live recording of the monthly forecast episodes, our monthly auspicious elections podcast, or another exclusive podcast series called the Casual Astrology Podcast, or you can even get your name listed in the credits at the end of each episode. For more information, visit patreon.com/astrologypodcast. If you're looking to get an astrological consultation, we have a list of recommended astrologers at theastrologypodcast.com/consultations. The astrologers on the list are friends of the podcast that have been featured in different episodes over the years, and they have different specialties such as natal astrology, electional astrology, synastry, rectification, or horary astrology. You can get a 10% discount when you book a consultation with one of the astrologers on our list by using the promo code AstrologyPodcast. The astrology software that we use and recommend here on the podcast is called SolarFire for Windows, which is available for the PC at alabe.com. Use the promo code AP15 to get a 15% discount. For Mac users, we recommend a software program called Astrogold for Mac OS, which is from the creators of SolarFire for PC, and it includes both modern and traditional techniques. You can find out more information at astrogold.io, and you can use the promo code AstroPodcast15 to get a 15% discount. If you'd like to learn more about my approach to astrology, then I'd recommend checking out my book titled Hellenistic Astrology, The Study of Fate and Fortune, where I go over the history, philosophy, and techniques of ancient astrology, taking people from beginner up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. You can get a print copy of the book through Amazon or other online retailers, or there's an ebook version available through Google Books. If you're really looking to expand your studies of astrology, then I would recommend my Hellenistic Astrology course, which is an online course on ancient astrology where I take people through basic concepts up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. There's over 100 hours of video lectures, as well as guided readings of ancient texts, and by the time you finish the course, you will have a strong foundation in how to read birth charts, as well as make predictions. You can find out more information at courses.theastrologyschool.com. And finally, thanks to our sponsors, including the Mountain Astrologer magazine, which is a quarterly astrology magazine, which you can read in print or online at mountainastrologer.com.